straight from the pages of a modern fairy tale.
She's got a successful career. She's living in one of the most vibrant cities in the world.
He was charming and exciting and loving, everything she always wanted in a partner.
They became a power couple. They'd make the perfect team.
But a foreboding call turns this romance story into a bone-chilling thriller.
I just got word that something horrible has happened.
He opened a suitcase and he discovered a letter, a typed letter.
It was clear to all of us that something wasn't right.
Detectives find themselves thrown into a case more sensational than most.
He was trying to turn this whole situation into an action-adventure novel.
It was very strange. I've never come across anything like that before in my career.
And with two sides to every story, it's up to investigators to determine which one to believe.
She found out he was hiding a secret.
When you get emotion involved, anything can happen.
Jealousy took over, and at some point it was uncontrollable.
There's an old saying, if somebody shows you who they are, you should believe them.
October 22nd, 2018, Montclair, New Jersey. It's a peaceful night in this upscale community, less than 20 miles west of Manhattan.
Montclair, New Jersey is a quiet, tree-lined street town that's considered a suburb of New York City.
It's very affluent. So there's a lot of homes that are over $1 million, and there's not a lot of crime.
But just before midnight, local police receive a cryptic tip.
At approximately 11:45 p.m., the police in Montclair, New Jersey, get a phone call from a man named Doug Pearson.
Montclair Police. Hello, I live in Pennsylvania. I just got word that something horrible potentially has happened there in Montclair, and no one is there to call in.
What happened?
I am not certain, but it sounds like there may be a murder victim there.
He said a woman by the name of Angela Bledsoe could be inside of a home in Montclair, dead.
Doug gives dispatch an address, and within minutes, a team of Montclair police officers are en route to the residence.
I responded to the scene, a larger single-family dwelling, mid-block on a quiet residential street.
Police enter the home with guns drawn, not sure what they're gonna walk into. However, when they flipped the lights on, their fears were confirmed.
The body, Miss Bledsoe, was on the floor of the kitchen.
There was quite a bit of blood where she was laying, and some of that blood had been there for a while.
Officers on scene confirm the caller's tip to headquarters.
Our units are going to be tied up for a little while. This just turned into a homicide investigation.
This one was the first homicide that I had been called about in my acting prosecutor position, and it was a name that was not unfamiliar to me, Angela Bledsoe.
Angela had a stellar reputation in her community.
In fact, 44-year-old Angela Bledsoe had achieved the kind of success that's envied by many.
She was a graduate of Florida A&M, a historically Black university in Tallahassee.
She was also a part of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, an organization that focuses on bettering the community.
She seems to have been a person who found her way through solid programs and grew to be quite a successful young woman.
After graduating in 1997, Angela got right to work.
She accepted a high-paying position in New York City as a financial consultant at a multinational bank.
She was so successful in her 20s that she was making more money than her parents had in a lifetime, practically, and they were so supportive of her.
She keeps her eyes on the prize, and for her, the prize is $1 million plus brownstone in Brooklyn before the age of 30, which is quite a rare task.
She continued to climb the corporate ladder, becoming a financial consultant and analyst at various banks and insurance agencies.
But as she reached her mid-30s, Angela began to feel like something was missing.
She wanted to find love. She wanted to enjoy all that life had given to her with someone special.
And in the spring of 2008, she'd find just that.
Angela, hey, Great to see you.
Likewise, Mr. Ray.
Please, call me James.
James Ray was an accomplished Manhattan attorney. He specialized in insurance.
They first met when James hired Angela to run his insurance brokerage. He felt that with her business savvy and his experience in law and insurance, they would make the perfect team.
Wow, this is great. I love your ideas.
Thank you.
55-year-old James also had an impressive past before getting his MBA.
Anything that he put his hands on, he did very well. Mr. Ray was a police officer for a short time, served in the Marine Corps, and was also a black belt in a martial art.
Listen, I have another meeting to get to, but how about we continue this conversation later? Over dinner, perhaps?
I would like that.
Great.
Along comes this successful man whose story is a lot like hers. So for her, it feels like, hello, Daddy.
The two soon became great partners in the boardroom and the bedroom.
Despite their 11-year age difference, Angela found James to be charming and exciting and loving, everything she always wanted in a partner.
They would go golfing on weekends, take trips to Martha's Vineyard, and would rub elbows with some of New York's most elite Black community. They became a power couple.
And in 2012, the dynamic duo became a party of three when they welcomed a beautiful baby girl.
Angela enjoyed being a mother, and James enjoyed doting on Angela and their daughter.
As their daughter grew older, James convinced Angela to sell her Brooklyn brownstone and move into his 6-bedroom home in Montclair, New Jersey.
Montclair feels like home. It feels like backyard. Life feels easier. And for a young woman who's probably been on the go since she was in high school to achieve, this probably felt like a place of peace.
But now, Montclair police have responded to a home that's anything but peaceful.
For something like this to happen in Montclair, it's very unheard of. You had a very well-known, likable person who Angela was. This one kind of hit home.
There was a multitude of indicators that were popping up that just didn't settle right with me and the other investigators.
We all had that gut feeling from the moment we walked in the door that there was something wrong here.
By the fall of 2018, Angela Bledsoe and James Ray had skyrocketed to the top of New York's social scene.
Angela was a powerhouse woman, and after meeting James Ray, Angela finally had someone to share her success with.
But on October 22nd, their idyllic Montclair home is swarming with police.
They have found Angela dead, and based on what they see, she was murdered. Angela had been shot 3 times, once in the chest, once in the back, and once in the head.
Police also discover a 4th shot that missed the mark.
There's a clock laying in the kitchen sink, and that clock had fallen from a hook, and it had stopped at 11:14.
It fell into the sink, and as it hit the sink, the battery popped out. Therefore, it memorialized the exact time that the incident occurred.
On the floor is where this large pool of blood was, and on top of that pool of blood was this 9mm handgun.
Let's back that up. Let's find out if it's our murder weapon.
Yes, sir.
About 5 or 6 feet away from her is a little stool, and on top of that stool is a phone.
It could belong to the victim, or it could belong to the killer.
Okay, let's back this up, too.
In the adjoining living room, investigators discover even more evidence.
We found a projectile with some blood on it embedded into the love seat. Additionally, we found a handprint or swipe of blood on the armrest of the love seat and the adjacent couch.
The crime scene itself makes it appear as though there's been a tussle.
Detectives are also drawn to the coffee table by the sofa.
On top of the table, we could clearly see empty gun cases and a cleaning kit.
There was 2 handgun boxes on the coffee table, and there was a Springfield XD9 pistol on one of them.
3 .45 caliber shell casings were placed standing up on end, side by side, inside of one of the gun boxes. That is odd, extremely peculiar.
Notably absent from the scene is the gun that matches the 45mm casings.
Hey, have we found a 45 caliber?
No, sir.
We found 9mm pistols. Where's the 45 caliber pistol?
And where is the owner of the home? Angela's boyfriend, James Ray.
I've probably been on over 100 homicide scenes, and this one, it just seemed a little eerie.
It was clear to all of us that something wasn't right.
In their search for answers, detectives circle back around to the 911 caller, a Pennsylvania resident named Doug Pearson.
He was the one that alerted the Montclair Police Department of what had taken place. We bring him back to our headquarters where a formal interview was conducted.
They wanted to know how he knew that Angela was dead.
Well, it all started last night around 6 p.m.
Doug explains that he got an unexpected visit from a family member.
That individual was Angela Bledsoe's boyfriend, James Ray.
Hey, how's it going, man?
I'm good. But listen, I got a favor to ask.
He asked him for an unusual request, and that was to keep his 6-year-old daughter for a week.
Angela and I are slammed with a big work emergency. It'll mean a lot to us if you can watch her.
Doug was family, so he wanted to help, so he reluctantly agreed.
No problem.
Thanks, man, I owe you. I got all her stuff packed. She's waiting in the car. I'll go grab her.
His behaviors were erratic and unusual.
It seems odd, but I never had a reason to doubt him. My wife and I is always happy to help out family. But then
what?
Later that night, they were getting the child ready for bed. He opened a suitcase that was left by James Ray, and he discovered a letter, a typed letter.
Honey!
This letter broke the case wide open.
Oh my God.
Detectives investigating the murder of 44-year-old financial advisor Angela Bledsoe have just learned that her attorney boyfriend, James Ray, was exhibiting strange behavior the night before she was found dead.
He asked a family member, Doug Pearson, to watch their 6-year-old daughter without much explanation.
And when Doug and his wife were getting Angela and James's daughter ready for bed, they made an alarming discovery.
Honey!
This suitcase that James has left includes this ominous note where James confesses to murdering Angela.
He confessed to killing Angela in their Montclair home. But according to James, it wasn't a cold-blooded murder. It was self-defense.
Take a look for yourself.
As detectives read over James's letter, it's clear that his once happy relationship with Angela had taken a dark turn.
James claimed that they would fight all the time and that Angela was becoming violent.
He indicated in the letter that she was cheating.
The letter alleges that on the morning of October 22nd, the situation came to a head.
James claimed he was cleaning his handgun when they got into a heated argument.
He said she grabbed a handgun from off the table and pointed at him. That put him in fear, and he grabbed a gun and he fired at her.
According to the letter, James was afraid no one would believe his story, so he decided to get out of town.
He sets up all of these pieces to make sure his daughter is safe.
He made reference also to checks that were left behind in the suitcase, that it was to go to their young daughter.
And he just, he flees.
James Ray was on the run.
So, did he leave anything else behind?
Yeah, he left his cell phone.
Doug was able to turn James's cell phone into the police. So they suspect the phone located at the crime scene belonged to Angela.
After speaking with Doug, authorities issue a BOLO for James and his vehicle to law enforcement agencies in the area, describing him as potentially armed and dangerous.
We had his phone, so tracking his phone was out of the picture. So our next thing was, where's his car? He has to be with his car. So we do a bunch of law enforcement checks on his car. That comes up negative.
While deputies search for James and his vehicle, detectives take a closer look at the cell phone they found at the crime scene.
They confirmed it belonged to Angela Bledsoe.
After working with the carrier to unlock the phone, detectives make a surprising discovery.
There was text messages in Angela's phone that were discovered between Angela and a male friend.
James was right about one thing. Angela was having an affair.
The two had been sexting, and it seemed as though they had met up on several occasions.
Hoping to learn more, detectives reach out to the man Angela had been corresponding with, 44-year-old Leon Holmes.
He lives more than 1,000 miles away in Orlando, Florida.
We identified who that individual was, and we made contact with him. He indicated that he was made aware that Angela was dead.
I found out through a mutual friend. I can't believe she's gone.
On the call, Leon confirms he'd been in a romantic relationship with Angela.
Leon tells investigators they had met as students together at FAMU in the 90s, and after graduation had gone their separate ways.
But a year earlier, in October 2017, Leon says they rekindled the feelings they'd had in college.
Leon says that he reconnected with Angela at a FAMU homecoming reunion. Over happy hour drinks, the two felt a spark and decided to stay in touch.
Leon confirmed that he and Angela had in fact been spending several weekends together between Orlando, where he lived, and New York City.
But according to Leon, he had no idea the connection he and Angela were building was actually an illicit affair.
He thought Angela was single.
Until recently, I had no idea she was in another relationship.
Leon says he didn't find out until October 20th, 2 days before Angela's body was discovered.
Hello?
I don't know who the hell you think you are.
Who is this?
James had discovered text messages between Angela and Leon on her phone.
Shortly after, Mr. Ray contacted the individual and threatened him.
I'm coming for you, man, if you don't stay away from Angela.
Listen, this is not what you...
Think I'm an idiot? Huh? I'm coming for you.
Leon was so frightened by James's rage that as soon as the call ended, he contacted Angela to warn her.
He's concerned for her life because James's behavior and his threats toward him made him feel menaced, and he's states away. Angela lives with this man.
Why didn't you tell me?
When Leon asked Angela if her and James were really living together, she confirmed that they were, but implied that the relationship was coming to an end.
Based on what detectives were piecing together, it seemed that as soon as James realized that Angela was having an affair, it really pushed him over the edge. And it seems that that may have driven him to commit murder.
Thank you so much, Leon, and if we need anything else, we'll contact you.
After speaking with Leon, detectives are more eager than ever to track down James Ray, and soon they'll get their chance.
Montclair detectives receive a tip. James's car had been spotted at Newark Liberty International Airport.
At that time, myself, Detective Muhammad, responded there, where we located the vehicle in the parking deck in Newark Airport. It was parked, locked. We could see inside on the dashboard that there was a parking ticket with the date and time.
The ticket shows James had entered the lot around the same time that the police responded to the homicide scene at his house.
The ticket in the window that we can clearly see indicated like 12:01. His car entered that lot.
But frustratingly, there are no clues to where James went next.
Once we conducted a search of the entire vehicle, there was no items of evidential value found. We did canvass the parking lot for surveillance video, however, there was none.
The fact that James left his car at an international airport heightens concerns.
Not only is he clearly no longer in the tri-state area, he could be anywhere.
Montclair police decide to recruit help from the FBI.
There's a procedure that you go through with the FBI that you call red tag, someone that might be on the run.
A red notice had to be served through Interpol.
While they wait for leads, detectives reach out to Angela's friends and family, hoping for more information that could help them find James.
As investigators sit down with Angela's loved ones, they're still mourning her loss.
But they also drop a bombshell.
Angela found out that James was keeping a secret.
He had a whole other family on the side.
For 48 hours, law enforcement agencies across the globe have been searching for 55-year-old James Ray, a Manhattan attorney wanted for shooting his girlfriend, Angela Bledsoe, to death.
He's left his cell phone behind, turned off. He dumped his car. He's nowhere to be found.
James also left behind a confession, claiming Angela's murder was an act of self-defense. But her loved ones aren't buying it.
According to Angela's friends and family, the only one that needed help being defended was Angela.
Well, it took us a while to realize what was really going on.
When they first got together, Angela and James were a match made in heaven. They were both successful Manhattanites making a name for themselves.
But the family explains that not long into their relationship, Angela and James hit a major bump in the road.
Angela found out that James was hiding a secret. He was married with 2 adult children.
That was the first red flag. Angela was shocked.
Normally, Angela would never date a married man, but she was so smitten with James, she decided to stick through the relationship.
And when Angela found out she was expecting a child of her own, the couple came to a crossroads.
She was essentially locked into their relationship, so she pushed James to end things with his wife so that they could be a family.
Angela has done too much, worked too hard to build up her name, life, reputation, and career to just be the side chick.
Eventually, James followed through and divorced his wife.
Angela moved in with James in his Montclair home, the same home that he had shared with his first wife.
But according to Angela's family, soon after she moved in with James, things started to change.
That's when he started showing his true colors.
Slowly but surely, she started to reveal that the relationship was not a healthy relationship.
Who's that?
It's just my sister.
You must really think I'm stupid to believe that. You're a liar.
She revealed to them that James Ray was very controlling. He spoke down to her in front of their child. He was demeaning towards her.
There's an old saying, if somebody shows you who they are, you should believe them.
Things reached a tipping point when James was able to confirm that there had been a physical relationship between Angela and Leon Holmes.
I already read the messages. I know you've been running around on me down in Florida.
You know what? I'm out of here.
You know what? You're gonna regret this. Both of you.
Yeah.
James had threatened to beat her and Leon up.
She ultimately made a decision that she was gonna abandon this relationship and seek out a better life for her and her child.
According to the family, in mid-October, Angela had bravely communicated her plans with James.
She'd sent him a text message that she was leaving the relationship, that she has tried everything she can to preserve it, and she was gonna be moving on.
And on October 22nd, the day she was killed, Angela put her plan into action.
She was taking the steps to move out.
She makes an appointment with a realtor to see some houses for she and her daughter.
and he was aware that she had been house hunting.
Angela's family also scoffs at the claims James made in his confession letter, that Angela pulled a gun on him first.
No, no way.
Loved ones all confirmed that Angela was a non-violent person.
It appears that James might have been trying to paint the picture of this angry black woman, but her family paints a completely different picture that seen no signs of any kind of aggression. It just wasn't who she was.
Her family was telling her to get out, and she unfortunately got out, just not in the way that she had hoped. She was removed from that home in a body bag.
Yet after a week with no sign of James, investigators begin to worry that he'll never face the consequences for what he's done.
Investigators are starting to become worried that the case will turn cold.
But on October 28, 2018, they finally catch a big break.
This is Rangers.
I remember it like it was yesterday. I received a phone call from the FBI, and they stated, hey, I think we have your guy. He's on a plane from Mexico City to Cuba. Right now, he's in the air. We're trying to get agents in Cuba so when the plane lands, we could arrest him.
That was an aspect to this case that I didn't expect, that I had never dealt with. While we've extradited people from other places, Cuba certainly wasn't one of them.
For decades, our relationship with Cuba has not been a good one. The fact that we're doing the work to extradite him back is a very big deal.
Fortunately, the plan works.
James was taken into FBI custody after his plane landed.
We were notified that he was coming back on November the 6th at Teterboro Airport, where we go and we wait for him.
Welcome back, James. Are you ready to talk?
But after the FBI hands him over to Montclair police, James refuses to give a statement.
He had this with him.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. He can go back to holding if he's not ready to talk.
Okay.
And from that point, we collect his personal effects, which was a large duffel bag.
And inside the duffel bag is a shocking new piece of evidence.
It was very strange. I've never come across anything like that before in my career.
He was trying to turn this whole situation into an action-adventure novel.
After a week on the lam, authorities have finally apprehended fugitive James Ray after he murdered his girlfriend, Angela Bledsoe, and fled to Cuba.
James Ray was public enemy number 1.
He gets to the police station and he refuses to offer a statement.
However, after going through his belongings, police discover something just as valuable.
Inside that bag, we're able to locate a 20-page manifesto that he had handwritten. It was very strange. I've never come across anything like that before in my career.
In it, James wrote about everything that happened, as if it was some adventure novel. He even said it deserved to be published and the proceeds should go to his daughter.
The manifesto, entitled On the Move, features main characters named Jack and Mousy instead of James and Angela.
It was a little odd reading the manifesto in another name and like a third-type person.
In the manifesto, James echoes a similar version of events as those in the confession letter.
The differences between the typed letter that James Ray left behind and the manifesto that we recovered off of him when he was returned to the United States is that the typed letter was short and it left out a lot of detail. The handwritten journal, it was clear. He spent a lot of time thinking about what he was gonna say.
James sticks to the claim that a heated argument had erupted while he was trying to clean his guns. But this time, his story is slightly different. He claims the bickering with Angela started after dropping their daughter off at school that morning.
After their heated discussion, they went their separate ways. Angela said she had errands to run.
You know what? I'm out of here.
So he felt it was a perfect time to clean all of his guns. So he removed them from his safe and he brought them down, placed them on the glass coffee table in the living room.
He gets up to go to the bathroom.
When he walked back into the living room, James claims Angela was sitting on the couch holding one of his guns.
She rants and raves about how things aren't working.
Be careful with that.
I can't do this anymore, James.
According to James, that's when his military training kicked in, and he picked up another weapon, firing in Angela's direction as he ran for cover.
Like out of some Rambo movie, it becomes a shootout where he's in survival mode.
He claims that he ran into the bathroom and hid.
And he says it feels like he was there for an eternity, and he comes out because it was quiet.
When he came out, he saw a trail of blood leading into the kitchen. He goes into the kitchen and he sees Angela on the floor. When she sees him, she raises up the gun to shoot at him.
He goes into fight or flight mode and just shoots wildly because he's got to defend himself, because she's been there poised and ready to just take him out.
When all the dust settles, he claims he goes up and checks on her. She's not breathing.
He goes into what do I do next mode, which then is when he decides to pack up his stuff, to pack up his daughter's stuff, to assemble all of the things that ended up in the suitcase that Doug had.
He then retrieved his daughter from school and went to meet Doug Pearson.
After dropping his daughter off, he then went to Newark Airport.
James knew police would be looking for his car, so he abandoned it at the Newark Airport.
From Newark Airport, he then took a taxi to Philadelphia, where he stayed a couple days. And during this whole time, from what the letter stated, he was in possession of the murder weapon.
He stayed a night living amongst the homeless, and then began to meticulously dismantle the gun and distribute it around town so that the gun in its entirety couldn't be found.
From there, James hitched rides traveling southbound, eventually landing in Texas.
He then takes a bus from Texas to Mexico, where he would have been under the radar. It is in Mexico that he takes a flight from Mexico to Cuba, which then sends off the bells and whistles.
When detectives finish reading James's manifesto, they're stunned.
We all looked at each other afterward and say, listen, there's no way that his story from the manifesto that she was the aggressor is in any way, shape, or form true. The crime scene was staged. We all had that gut feeling from the moment we walked in the door that there was something wrong here.
This was nothing close to self-defense. It was not passion, provocation, manslaughter. This was a straight-up, cold-blooded murder.
But will justice ever be served in this sensational case?
COVID-19 hits. And so even though James Ray is locked up, the world is locked down.
In the fall of 2018, Montclair police finally have attorney James Ray in custody for the murder of his live-in girlfriend, Angela Bledsoe. But bringing James to justice will be easier said than done.
COVID-19 hits. And so the trial for James Ray for the murder of Angela Bledsoe just keeps getting pushed around simply because the courts can't open. Even though James Ray is locked up, the world is locked down.
It took 4 years for this case to actually go to trial.
Finally, in March of 2023, James Ray's trial begins in a packed Essex County courtroom. Prosecutors open their case by painting the portrait of the real man behind James's facade.
He was just a real controlling, narcissistic man who wanted to keep her in her place and was really taken back that she didn't want to be with him anymore.
As an example of his spiraling behavior, prosecutors play a recording of a phone call James made to a friend just hours after the shooting.
Hear me out. She says, oh, she's upset and annoyed because 5 years ago, I wasn't available to be there with her when she was pregnant. I said, I was married, you know that. Yeah, but you didn't show that you killed. What?
He rants about everything, about her infidelity, about his state of being, about how he just couldn't take it anymore, and he seemed unhinged.
Though he never outright admits to his friend that he killed Angela, he does make some cryptic implications.
I'm going to speak in generalities, and it's going to sound scary, but don't get scared. Okay. Sometimes you have to protect people in a way that's unconventional.
What, the things you go through to protect people, you're saying?
Yes, you really do.
Following the cryptic phone call, prosecutors bring in a ballistics expert to debunk the story James told in his manifesto.
We were asked to look at the case, the evidence of the case, and we were able to determine what we believed was the sequence of events that occurred that evening.
Experts conclude that the crime scene isn't consistent with a shootout, but rather an execution, starting in the living room.
James, we need to talk. I found a house, and I'm moving out.
No, you're not going anywhere.
What do you mean? What are you doing, James?
Ms. Bledsoe received a gunshot wound to the front of her upper torso. That projectile exited her back. The projectile then lodged in the backrest cushion of the sofa.
She then gets up, and we know that because there's a bloody handprint on the armrest, and then there's a trail of blood that starts to lead from the living room into the kitchen.
Experts believe Angela was crawling into the kitchen when James fired the second shot.
At some point between where she was first shot and her final resting position, she received additional gunfire, and that gunshot came into her back.
She had to have been shot in the back prior to coming to her final resting position because her final resting position was on her back.
Fighting for her life, Angela was able to turn over for one last look at her former lover as he stood over her and fired the final shot.
There was nowhere else he could have been except standing right over her when he delivered that gunshot. So the ballistics in this case and the wound paths completely demolished any claim of self-defense that James Ray was trying to assert.
Question has to be asked, just from any investigative standpoint. You're holding a firearm in your hand. You've already fired the firearm. You've already struck the individual. If you're that much in fear, why don't you leave?
He could have went to the neighbors and he could have called for help. He didn't do anything like that.
Frankly, Mr. Ray gave us everything we needed to disprove his claim of self-defense. When he left the crime scene the way it was, Mr. Ray helped us actually prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt that it was in fact an intentional, knowing murder.
After a 7-week trial, it only takes the jury 3 hours to reach a verdict.
He was found guilty of first-degree murder, and it was just sheer joy, sheer elation.
But just a few days before James is due to face a sentencing of up to life in prison, the story takes one last shocking turn.
On June 18, 2023, Father's Day, James Ray was found unresponsive in his cell at Essex County Correctional Facility.
James is rushed to the hospital, but it's too late. He's pronounced dead from a drug overdose.
It kind of brings disappointment to the investigation, to the prosecution, and also to the family itself.
He needed to hear the impact statements, and they wanted to let them know what they felt. And he ducked what he needed to hear from the loved ones.
Justice fell a little short for the Bledsoe family, and that's too bad. They deserve.
March 1st, 1932. Night had settled over the countryside of New Jersey with the quiet confidence of a world that believed nothing extraordinary could happen before dawn. The winter was reluctant to leave. Bare branches stretched across the dark sky like long fingers, scratching against drifting clouds while a cold wind wandered between the trees surrounding the Lineburgh estate. The house stood alone on a hill, its stone walls rising from the earth like a fortress built to keep danger outside. Every window reflected only darkness. Every room seemed wrapped in the ordinary silence of a family preparing for another peaceful night. From a distance, there was nothing unusual. A warm glow escaped through a handful of windows. Curtains barely moved with the draft. Somewhere inside, a clock continued its patient rhythm, measuring seconds that nobody believed would become part of history. The fireplaces had softened the chill that lingered from the afternoon rain. Servants moved quietly through the halls, careful not to disturb the child sleeping upstairs. The routine was familiar, almost comforting. It was the kind of evening millions of parents had lived through without ever imagining it might become the last ordinary memory they would have. Beyond the gates, the road disappeared into darkness. Few travelers passed this way after sunset. The estate had been chosen precisely because it offered privacy, distance from crowds, and an escape from the relentless attention that had followed America's most celebrated aviator ever since he crossed the Atlantic alone. Here, surrounded by forests and rolling farmland, the family hoped they could finally breathe without cameras watching every smile, every meal, every moment with their son. But isolation has two faces. The same silence that promises peace can also hide footsteps. The same darkness that shields a family from the public eye can conceal someone patiently watching from beyond the trees. Long before anyone inside the house realized something was wrong, another story may already have been unfolding beyond the reach of candlelight. Someone had crossed frozen ground. Someone had studied the windows. Someone had carried tools instead of weapons. Wood instead of steel. Rope instead of force. Every movement suggested planning rather than impulse. Whoever approached the house that night understood that violence was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived with extraordinary patience. Inside the nursery, the air was warmer than the hall outside. A small child slept beneath blankets carefully tucked around his tiny body. He was only 20 months old, too young to understand the fame attached to his family name, too young to know that newspaper headlines had transformed his father into a legend before he himself had even learned to speak. His breathing rose and fell in gentle rhythm. A favorite blanket rested beside him. Toy sat untouched nearby, waiting for another morning of laughter that would never arrive. His parents believed he was safe. Every parent has moments like these. You check on your child before going to bed. You pull the blanket a little higher. You close the door softly. You tell yourself tomorrow will be another ordinary day. There is no warning. No invisible countdown. No feeling that history has quietly stepped into your home. Charles Lindbergh had spent years confronting danger that few men dared to face. He had crossed oceans alone with only an aircraft and determination standing between life and death. He had survived mechanical uncertainty, exhaustion, unpredictable weather, and the vast emptiness above the Atlantic. Around the world, millions admired him as the embodiment of courage. Newspapers called him fearless. Politicians praised him. Children dreamed of becoming him. Yet every hero eventually encounters an enemy that cannot be defeated by skill alone. An airplane could be controlled. A storm could be navigated. But no father, regardless of fame, fortune, or courage, could negotiate with fate once it entered his own home. The irony would become impossible to ignore. A man who conquered the sky would soon discover he could not protect the room just above his own staircase. As the evening continued, nothing appeared broken. Dinner had ended quietly. Conversations faded. Doors closed. Lights dimmed. The enormous house settled into the familiar sounds that old buildings always make after midnight. Wooden floors expanded and contracted. Pipes whispered inside the walls. Wind brushed against windows before disappearing into the surrounding woods. None of these sounds seemed important then. Later, investigators would wonder whether any of them had concealed something far more significant. Outside, clouds drifted across the moon. Darkness thickened. The trees became shadows. Somewhere beyond the reach of the porch lights, an unseen figure waited. Whether driven by greed, desperation, arrogance, or something darker remains one of history's enduring questions. Motive often becomes clearer after a crime. On that night, however, motive remained invisible. Only intention existed. Calm. Deliberate. Patient. Hours earlier, the world still celebrated the Lineburg family. Their name represented hope during one of America's most difficult decades. The Great Depression had shattered countless lives. Banks had failed. Families struggled to find work. Breadlines stretched through city streets. Yet Charles Lindbergh remained a symbol that extraordinary achievements were still possible. His success belonged not only to himself but to an entire nation searching desperately for reasons to believe in the future. That fame, however, carried a hidden cost. People knew where he lived. People followed newspaper stories about his family. People admired his child without ever meeting him. Admiration can become obsession. Curiosity can become opportunity. Somewhere among the millions reading headlines about America's first family of aviation, someone may have begun imagining that the nation's greatest hero possessed something more valuable than fame. A son. The estate itself reflected the family's desire for peace rather than luxury. Although impressive, it was not designed as a palace surrounded by soldiers. It was a home. Wide staircases connected quiet bedrooms. Hallways carried the faint scent of polished wood. Windows overlooked fields instead of crowded streets. Privacy seemed abundant. Security seemed unnecessary. Looking back, historians would examine every detail. Why was the nursery on the second floor? Why was the window left accessible? Why had the ladder been constructed the way it was? Why did nobody hear anything unusual? Questions multiplied because answers remained painfully incomplete. Crimes of this magnitude always invite hindsight. People imagine they would have noticed the warning signs. They believe they would have heard the footsteps. They convince themselves they would never have overlooked something so important. Reality is rarely so generous. Most catastrophes begin in absolute normality. A routine evening. A familiar room. A child asleep. Then one decision. One movement. One moment impossible to reverse. The nursery window overlooked darkness stretching toward the trees. During daylight, the view was peaceful. Rolling hills softened the horizon while birds nested among branches that danced in the spring breeze. At night, however, that same landscape transformed into an ocean of black silhouettes. Distance became impossible to judge. Shadows blended together. Anyone standing beyond the nearest trees could disappear completely. Perhaps that anonymity was exactly what someone had counted on. No alarms echoed across the property. No barking dogs shattered the silence. No frantic cries interrupted the wind. History often imagines famous crimes arriving with theatrical drama, but the most devastating acts frequently unfold almost invisibly. A door opens. A floorboard creaks. A window shifts by only an inch. A sleeping child never wakes. Then the silence returns. The house continues breathing as though nothing has happened. Minutes pass. Perhaps even an hour. Life inside continues untouched by the unimaginable truth unfolding just beyond a bedroom wall. When people later tried to reconstruct those missing moments, they discovered that certainty had vanished almost entirely. Every witness remembered fragments. Every statement carried assumptions. Every timeline contained empty spaces where nobody could honestly say what had happened. Those empty spaces became fertile ground for speculation that would continue for generations. Some believed the kidnapping had been planned for months. Others argued it had gone terribly wrong almost immediately. Some suspected one criminal. Others imagined an entire conspiracy. Decades later, books, documentaries, historians, detectives, and legal scholars would continue examining those same unanswered questions, each hoping to illuminate a darkness that had never fully lifted. But on this particular night, none of that existed yet. There was only a family sleeping beneath one roof. A child dreaming innocent dreams. And somewhere beyond the nursery window, history waiting with cold, patient hands. Time has a strange way of slowing inside moments that no one recognizes as important. At 10 o'clock that evening, there was still no sense of urgency inside the Lineburg home. The day had followed its familiar rhythm. Meals had been served. Letters had been answered. Quiet conversations drifted through the halls before fading into the ordinary routines of family life. Outside, the wind continued to sweep across the fields, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and melting snow. The trees swayed gently against the night sky, their branches rubbing together with a sound so soft it could easily be mistaken for whispers. The nursery remained still. A small wooden crib stood near the window. A blanket covered the child, tucked carefully around him only a short while earlier. Beside the crib rested a tiny stuffed toy that had survived countless embraces from little hands still learning to understand the world around them. Every object inside the room spoke the language of innocence. Nothing suggested that the room would soon become one of the most examined crime scenes in American history. Downstairs, Charles Lineburg moved through the evening without the burden of suspicion. His reputation had been built upon extraordinary precision. Every decision he made during his famous transatlantic flight had demanded discipline, patience, and absolute concentration. Yet inside his own home, he was simply a father. Fame remained outside the walls. Here, he was concerned with ordinary things, the comfort of his family, the warmth of the fire, tomorrow's plans. And Morrow Lineburg carried herself with the quiet composure that had become essential after years of public attention. Life beside one of the world's most recognizable men was never truly private. Reporters followed every journey. Cameras documented every public appearance. Strangers discussed their marriage as though they knew them personally. Highfields had been their answer to all of it, a place where their son could grow surrounded by trees instead of photographers. Privacy, however, is never the same as protection. The estate was large enough that silence became part of its architecture. Hallways absorbed footsteps. Thick walls softened distant sounds. Bedrooms were separated by enough space that a faint noise in one corner of the house might never reach another. It was a comforting design for peaceful nights. It also meant danger could move quietly. Somewhere beyond those walls, someone had already crossed the invisible boundary separating observer from intruder. There was no dramatic crash. No shattered glass. No frantic struggle echoing through the corridors. Instead, investigators would later piece together a sequence that seemed almost impossible because of its simplicity. A handmade ladder. A second-floor window. A sleeping child. An escape into darkness. The ladder itself would become an object of endless fascination. It was not purchased from a hardware store. It had been built piece by someone who understood wood well enough to shape it into a practical tool. Different types of lumber had been combined with remarkable confidence. The craftsmanship suggested experience rather than improvisation. Whoever carried it toward the house had not expected to abandon it. Yet something had gone wrong. One section fractured under weight, leaving broken rails scattered beneath the nursery window. That broken wood would eventually speak louder than almost any witness. But not yet. For now, it lay unnoticed beneath the darkness. Inside the nursery, nothing interrupted the child's sleep. Charles Augustus Lineburg Jr. had no understanding of the hopes projected onto him by an entire nation. To millions of Americans, he represented the future of a family already woven into the country's imagination. Newspapers affectionately called him the Eagle's son. Readers eagerly consumed every published photograph of his smiling face. They watched him grow from afar, celebrating birthdays and milestones as though he belonged, in some small way, to everyone. Fame has a dangerous habit of dissolving boundaries. When a family becomes a symbol, strangers begin feeling connected to lives they have never actually lived. Most connections remain harmless. Some become unhealthy. A very small number become catastrophic. As the evening deepened, Highfield seemed completely isolated from the outside world. Telephone lines stretched across quiet countryside. The nearest neighbors were separated by fields and winding roads. Passing automobiles were uncommon after dark. Anyone approaching the estate could do so with little fear of attracting attention. Perhaps that was exactly why this house had been chosen. Not because it belonged to America's most famous aviator. Not only because of wealth, but because privacy created opportunity. Every successful kidnapping depends upon control. Control over time. Control over movement. Control over panic. The person responsible appeared to understand that every additional minute before discovery increased the distance between victim and rescuers. Inside the house, those precious minutes slipped away unnoticed. Eventually, the routine changed. The family nurse entered the nursery expecting nothing more than another ordinary check on the sleeping child. The room felt strangely quiet. At first glance, nothing seemed dramatically different. Moonlight filtered through the window. Shadows rested across the wooden floor. The blanket no longer covered a sleeping toddler. The crib was empty. For one suspended heartbeat, the mind naturally searched for ordinary explanations. Perhaps someone had already taken him downstairs. Perhaps one of his parents had moved him. Perhaps she had entered the wrong room. Then her eyes found the open window. Cold air drifted inside. Curtains moved gently. Beyond the windowsill, darkness waited. Panic does not arrive all at once. It grows. A question becomes confusion. Confusion becomes disbelief. Disbelief collapses into terror. The nurse called for the parents. Voices echoed through the corridors. Footsteps thundered across polished floors that moments earlier had known only silence. Charles Lindbergh reached the nursery and immediately understood that something impossible had happened. The open window. The empty crib. The cold air. Each detail fit together with horrifying speed. He looked outside. Beneath the window, barely visible in the darkness, lay the shattered ladder. Nearby rested an envelope. Its placement felt deliberate. Almost ceremonial. The message inside would transform an already unimaginable nightmare into something even more disturbing. The handwriting appeared awkward, filled with unusual spellings and grammatical mistakes. The words demanded money in exchange for the child's safe return. $50,000. A staggering amount during the depths of the Great Depression, when countless American families struggled to earn enough for food. More unsettling than the demand itself was the strange symbol sign beneath it. Interlocking circles. Small punched holes. A crude emblem unlike any official signature. It served one purpose. Future letters could be authenticated. The kidnappers were planning ahead. That realization changed everything. This was not a crime born from sudden impulse. Someone had anticipated negotiations. Someone expected correspondence. Someone believed they controlled the future. Within minutes, the quiet estate exploded into motion. Telephones rang. Servants hurried through hallways carrying messages. Neighbors arrived. Local police rushed toward the property beneath flashing headlights that cut through the darkness like searching eyes. Officers examined footprints disappearing into muddy ground. Lanterns swept across fields surrounding the estate. Every patch of disturbed earth became significant. Every broken branch suggested possibility. Every distant sound drew immediate attention before dissolving back into silence. Hope remained alive. Kidnapping, unlike murder, carries with it a terrible form of optimism. As long as no body is found, every minute offers the possibility that the victim is still breathing. That fragile hope drove the first frantic hours of the investigation. Search parties spread outward from the house before dawn. Men carrying flashlights combed through woods blackened by winter shadows. Others followed nearby roads, questioning anyone who might have noticed an unfamiliar automobile or stranger. Detectives examined the ladder beneath powerful lamps, careful not to destroy fingerprints that might still cling to its wooden rails. Every discovery seemed capable of changing everything. Every disappointment deepened the fear that the kidnappers had already vanished beyond reach. Word traveled astonishingly fast. By sunrise, newspaper offices across America had abandoned planned front pages. Extra editions rolled off printing presses. Radio stations interrupted regular programming. The disappearance of Charles Lindbergh's son instantly became national news. Millions of people woke expecting stories about politics, business, or the struggling economy. Instead, they encountered a headline almost too shocking to believe. America's greatest hero had not lost an airplane. He had lost his child. Across the country, breakfast tables fell silent as families stared at the same photographs. Mothers instinctively looked toward their own children. Fathers imagined the terror unfolding inside the Lindbergh home. For one brief moment, celebrity disappeared. What remained was something every parent understood without explanation. An empty crib. An unanswered question. And a night that refused to end. Morning arrived without bringing relief. Instead of washing away the fear that had settled over Highfields, the first light of dawn revealed just how exposed everything had always been. The sprawling estate that had once promised safety now looked impossibly vulnerable. The fields stretched endlessly in every direction, interrupted only by clusters of bare trees and narrow country roads disappearing into the distance. In daylight, investigators could finally see the path that darkness had hidden only hours before. They could measure footprints, examine broken branches, study the shattered ladder beneath the nursery window. Yet for every answer the morning offered, it created two more questions. The nursery no longer looked like a child's room. It looked like the center of a storm. Detectives moved carefully around the crib, speaking in lowered voices as photographers documented every inch of the room. Fingerprint powder settled across windowsills. Measuring tapes crossed the wooden floor. The broken ladder was carried away piece by piece, each fragment labeled and preserved with the hope that somewhere inside its grain, the identity of its builder had been left behind. Outside, automobiles continued arriving one after another. Local officers became state investigators. State investigators were joined by federal authorities in advisory roles. Reporters gathered beyond the property line, notebooks already filling with details, rumors, and speculation. Camera flashes punctured the gray morning. Telephone lines buzzed constantly as editors demanded updates from correspondents standing in the cold. Before the day was over, the kidnapping had become more than a criminal investigation. It had become a national obsession. The Lindbergh name guaranteed that. But another reason made the story impossible to ignore. This crime violated something deeper than celebrity. It invaded the most universal place imaginable, a child's bedroom. Across America, parents checked locks they had ignored for years. Curtains were pulled tighter that evening. Children who normally slept in separate rooms were brought closer to their mothers and fathers. Newspapers published sketches of the homemade ladder. Citizens debated how such a thing could happen inside the home of one of the country's most admired men. If Charles Lindbergh could not protect his family, who could? That question lingered over the nation like a gathering storm. Inside Highfields, hope and dread existed side by side. Every telephone call forced the family to stop breathing for a moment. Every automobile approaching the house carried the possibility of good news or devastating confirmation that none would come. The ransom letter had changed everything. It offered a reason to believe the child was still alive. As long as someone demanded money, there remained a possibility that the kidnapping had been committed for profit rather than revenge. Investigators understood that negotiations required patience. The smallest mistake could place the child's life in immediate danger. Every decision became a balancing act between aggressive police work and cautious restraint. Meanwhile, the unknown person behind the crime remained invisible. No confirmed witnesses. No reliable description. Only scattered fragments left behind in darkness. The mystery itself began feeding the public imagination. Was it a professional gang? A desperate man ruined by the Great Depression? Someone with inside knowledge of the estate? or someone who had watched the Lineburg family from a distance for months, learning their routines with frightening precision. Every possibility seemed believable. None could be proven. Years later, historians would still argue over the same questions, returning again and again to the first hours after the kidnapping, searching for the single overlooked detail that might have changed everything. Perhaps that detail never existed. Some crimes leave behind evidence. Others leave behind only absence. An empty crib. A broken ladder. A handwritten note. And silence. That silence would echo far beyond New Jersey. It would shape criminal investigations for decades. It would influence American law. It would divide experts over guilt and innocence. It would inspire books, films, documentaries, and courtroom debates long after every principal figure in the case had passed into history. Yet at its heart, beneath all the legal arguments and forensic analysis, the Lineburg kidnapping was never just a mystery. It was the story of a family whose ordinary evening ended in irreversible tragedy. It was the story of a nation that watched every development in real time, convinced that somewhere, somehow, the next headline would announce a miraculous reunion. Instead, the headlines would grow darker. The search would widen. The ransom negotiations would become increasingly desperate. The investigation would stumble through false leads, public pressure, and relentless media scrutiny before finally pointing toward a suspect whose conviction would remain controversial for generations. Even today, nearly a century later, people still ask the same unsettling question. Was justice truly served? Or did one of history's most famous criminal cases leave behind mysteries that can never be resolved? Before we examine the evidence, the suspects, the trial that newspapers would call the trial of the century, and the debates that continue to divide historians, we must return to where every true crime story truly begins, not with the investigation, but with the lives that existed before violence entered the picture. Because before Charles Augustus Lineburg Jr. became one of the most recognizable victims in American history, he was simply a little boy learning to walk, laugh, and explore the world around him. Before his father became a grieving symbol for an entire nation, he was a man trying to build a quiet home for the people he loved most. And before one cold night in March changed everything forever, there was a family searching for something that fame could never buy: an ordinary life. That ordinary life is where the next chapter begins. The story of the Lineburg kidnapping did not begin with a ransom note or a broken ladder. It began years earlier, in an era when America desperately wanted heroes. The nation was changing faster than many people could understand. Cities climbed higher into the sky with steel and concrete. Automobiles crowded roads that had once belonged to horses. Airplanes, still regarded by many as dangerous experiments, promised to shrink the distance between continents. The future seemed to arrive one invention at a time, carrying both excitement and uncertainty. Among those symbols of progress, no figure stood taller than Charles Augustus Lineburg. His face appeared in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. School children memorized his name. Manufacturers used his image to sell everything from watches to breakfast cereal. Politicians sought opportunities to stand beside him. To millions of Americans, he represented courage stripped down to its simplest form, a young man climbing alone into an airplane and flying across an ocean that had defeated countless others before him. When Lineburg completed his non-stop flight from New York to Paris in May 1927 aboard the Spirit of St. Louis, he did far more than win a prize. He entered mythology. The flight lasted more than 33 exhausting hours. Alone inside a cramped cockpit, he battled fatigue so severe that he later described seeing illusions dancing before his eyes. Clouds swallowed the aircraft. Darkness erased the horizon. Sleep tempted him every passing minute. Yet somehow, against every reasonable expectation, he emerged over Europe and landed safely in France. The world erupted. Crowds surged through the streets just to catch a glimpse of him. Telegrams poured in from presidents, kings, scientists, and ordinary citizens. Parades followed him wherever he traveled. Newspapers called him Lucky Lindy. His smile became instantly recognizable, his quiet confidence making him appear almost untouched by the chaos surrounding him. Fame arrived so quickly that even simple errands became impossible. Walking through a train station meant pushing through hundreds of admirers. Leaving a hotel required police escorts. Children reached out hoping to shake his hand. Adults collected scraps of paper bearing nothing more than his signature. What had begun as admiration slowly transformed into relentless attention. For Charles Lindbergh, the line between public life and private life disappeared almost overnight. Yet behind the headlines was a man who had never seemed comfortable living as a celebrity. Friends described him as disciplined, reserved, and intensely private. He valued routine over spectacle. He preferred quiet conversations to grand speeches. Flying appealed to him because it rewarded precision rather than personality. An airplane did not care whether its pilot was famous. It demanded preparation, concentration, and respect. That mindset shaped every part of his life. It also shaped the family he hoped to build. And Morrow entered that story from a remarkably different world. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and possessed a curiosity that extended far beyond the social expectations placed upon women of her generation. Born into a prominent family, she had grown up surrounded by education, literature, and public service. Her father served as a diplomat, exposing anti-cultures and ideas that broadened her perspective long before she met the aviator whose name had already become legend. Their first meetings carried little of the glamour newspapers later imagined. Charles was quiet and was observant. Neither seemed interested in performing for the attention surrounding them. Instead, they discovered something surprisingly rare beneath the glare of international fame: genuine compatibility. She admired his discipline. He admired her intellect. Together, they shared a fascination with aviation that went beyond adventure. And trained as a pilot herself, becoming one of the first American women to earn a glider pilot's license. She accompanied Charles on aerial expeditions around the world, helping with navigation, radio communication, and meticulous documentation of each journey. To the public, they looked like the perfect modern couple. Two intelligent people exploring a rapidly changing world from the skies above it. Magazine covers celebrated them. Journalists described their marriage with almost fairy tale enthusiasm. The nation projected its hopes onto them, believing they represented the promise of a brighter future despite the growing economic hardships surrounding ordinary Americans. But idealized lives often conceal invisible burdens. Wherever they traveled, photographers followed. Hotels leaked information about their arrivals. Private moments rarely remained private for long. The public believed fame was a privilege. The Lindberghs increasingly experienced it as confinement. By the early 1930s, America itself had changed dramatically. The optimism that defined the late 1920s had collapsed into uncertainty. The Great Depression left millions unemployed. Families lost homes, savings, and livelihoods almost overnight. Breadlines became common sights in major cities. Businesses closed their doors. Farmers struggled against drought and failing markets. Every newspaper carried stories of hardship. Against that backdrop, the Lindbergh family remained symbols of hope. People wanted to believe that greatness still existed. That courage still mattered. That the future had not been completely consumed by despair. Every photograph of Charles and Anne with their young son offered a comforting image during difficult times. A smiling child. Proud parents. A family seemingly untouched by the suffering affecting so many others. The reality, however, was more complicated. No amount of fame could purchase peace. As public fascination intensified, Charles and Anne searched for somewhere beyond the reach of constant attention. They longed for a place where reporters could not easily gather outside their windows. A place where their son could learn to walk across grass rather than polished hotel floors. A home where the sound of birds might replace the endless clicking of camera shutters. That search eventually led them to the rolling countryside of New Jersey. Highfields was not selected because it was extravagant. It was selected because it felt isolated. The estate rested atop gentle hills surrounded by woods and open farmland. Winding roads discouraged casual visitors. The nearest neighbors lived far enough away that silence became one of the property's defining features. During daylight, sunlight spilled across wide fields where changing seasons painted entirely different landscapes. Spring covered the hills with fresh green. Summer filled the air with birdsong. Autumn transformed the forests into waves of crimson and gold. Winter settled quietly over frozen ground, leaving the estate wrapped in stillness. To Charles and Anne, Highfields represented something increasingly precious. Distance. Not emotional distance from the world, but physical distance from endless observation. Here, they believed, their son could grow up climbing trees instead of posing for photographers. He could chase butterflies through open fields without strangers recording every step. Birthdays could remain family celebrations rather than national events. For a brief period, that dream seemed possible. The rhythms of daily life returned. Breakfasts were shared without reporters waiting outside. Afternoons passed in relative peace. Evenings ended with family routines that millions of parents would recognize. Charles often immersed himself in work or correspondence. Anne devoted herself to writing and motherhood. The nursery became the emotional center of the house, filled with toys, children's books, and the small discoveries that accompany every stage of early childhood. Little Charles Jr. was growing quickly. At 20 months old, curiosity guided almost every movement. Each room presented something new to explore. Every object became an opportunity to learn. His laughter echoed through hallways that had once known only silence. Servants spoke affectionately about his cheerful personality. Friends noticed how naturally his parents' guarded expression softened whenever he entered the room. Inside Highfields, he was never America's baby. He was simply their son. That distinction mattered deeply to his parents. They worked tirelessly to preserve it. Yet even as they built a quieter life, the outside world never entirely disappeared. Letters arrived by the hundreds. Gifts appeared from strangers. Requests for interviews continued. Curious visitors occasionally found their way toward the estate despite its secluded location. Most meant no harm. Many genuinely admired the family. But admiration, when multiplied by millions, creates consequences impossible to predict. The Lindbergh name had become one of the most recognizable names on Earth. And somewhere beyond the peaceful fields surrounding Highfields, someone else had learned it too, not with admiration, but with intention. Highfields was more than an address on a map. It was a promise the Lindbergh family made to themselves. Every stone in its walls, every tree lining the long approach to the house, every quiet morning without reporters gathered outside the gate represented a small victory over the life they had been forced to live since Charles Lindbergh became the world's most celebrated aviator. To an outsider, the estate appeared almost idyllic. The surrounding countryside rolled gently toward the horizon, interrupted only by weathered fences, narrow dirt roads, and patches of woodland where birds nested undisturbed. During spring, the air carried the scent of fresh earth and budding leaves. In summer, crickets filled the evenings with their steady chorus. Even in winter, when frost settled across the fields and the trees stood bare against gray skies, there was a calmness that felt impossible to find anywhere near New York City. For Charles and Anne, that calmness was invaluable. Their son was growing during a period when every stage of his childhood attracted public fascination. Newspapers eagerly printed photographs whenever they could obtain them. Readers who had never met the little boy knew his face almost as well as they knew his father's. Every birthday became a story. Every public appearance generated another wave of headlines. The attention was affectionate, but it was relentless. Charles understood better than most that admiration could become overwhelming. He had experienced it from the moment he stepped out of the Spirit of St. Louis in Paris. At first, the celebrations had been exhilarating. Crowds cheered his name. Cities organized parades. Presidents invited him to the White House. Foreign governments awarded medals. Yet as the months turned into years, applause slowly transformed into intrusion. Strangers expected access to every part of his life simply because they had celebrated his achievements. He rarely complained publicly. Instead, he withdrew. Friends often remarked that he seemed happiest when surrounded by machines, maps, and the open sky rather than crowds. Flying demanded concentration, not conversation. It rewarded preparation instead of performance. In the cockpit, fame disappeared. Physics treated every pilot equally. At home, however, escaping recognition proved almost impossible. And noticed the burden as clearly as anyone. Though graceful under public scrutiny, she understood how exhausting constant visibility had become for her husband. She shared his desire for ordinary moments that no newspaper would ever document. An afternoon reading beside a fireplace. A quiet walk across the property. Dinner without photographers waiting outside the window. Those moments became the foundation of life at Highfields. The estate itself reflected simplicity rather than extravagance. The architecture favored comfort over grandeur. Wide hallways connected spacious rooms filled with practical furnishings instead of lavish displays of wealth. Large windows overlooked open fields, allowing sunlight to flood the interior during the day. The nursery occupied a peaceful corner of the second floor, chosen for its quiet atmosphere and beautiful view across the countryside. From that window, little Charles Jr. could see trees swaying gently in the wind. He could watch birds crossing the morning sky. On rainy afternoons, droplets raced each other down the glass while distant clouds rolled over the hills. It was exactly the kind of environment his parents had hoped would shape his earliest memories. He was too young to appreciate the significance of his family name. At 20 months old, the world consisted of simple discoveries. The texture of wooden toys beneath his fingertips. The excitement of hearing familiar footsteps approaching his room. The comfort of his mother's voice. The reassuring presence of his father lifting him effortlessly into the air before setting him back down amid laughter. Servants later described him as an energetic, affectionate child whose curiosity seemed endless. He explored every corner within reach, fascinated by ordinary objects adults barely noticed. A book left on a chair. Sunlight stretching across the floor. A bird landing outside the nursery window. Childhood transformed each of these into moments of wonder. His parents treasured those moments because they knew how quickly childhood disappeared. Charles often found himself balancing two identities that refused to remain separate. To the world, he was an international hero. To his son, he was simply the familiar face appearing at the nursery door after work. There was no applause inside Highfields. No cheering crowds. No speeches. Only family. Only home. It was a balance he fought to protect. The irony that history would later emphasize is impossible to ignore. A man celebrated for conquering distance could never fully escape the reach of public fascination. Every major achievement had brought more admiration. Every new admirer increased the number of strangers who knew intimate details about his family. Articles described the estate. Magazines published photographs. Journalists speculated about daily routines. None of this seemed particularly dangerous at the time. Celebrity culture was evolving rapidly, and few people considered how easily publicly available information could be assembled by someone with malicious intentions. Modern audiences often assume famous families understand the risks surrounding personal security. In the early 1930s, those standards barely existed. Bodyguards were uncommon. Electronic surveillance systems did not exist. Security cameras belonged to science fiction rather than reality. Privacy relied largely upon geography and trust. If a house stood far enough from busy roads, many believed it was naturally secure. That belief shaped life at Highfields. Visitors arrived by invitation. Employees became trusted members of the household. The surrounding woods created the comforting illusion that unwanted eyes remained far away. Yet landscapes reveal themselves differently depending on perspective. To the family, the trees offered peace. To someone approaching unnoticed, those same trees offered concealment. The long driveway that made unexpected visitors easy to observe during daylight became nearly invisible after sunset. The rolling terrain muffled distant sounds. Darkness erased clear sightlines. Everything that made the estate attractive also created vulnerabilities few recognized until it was too late. None of those vulnerabilities seemed obvious during ordinary days. Life followed predictable routines. Breakfast appeared each morning at nearly the same hour. Letters were sorted. Household staff completed familiar tasks with quiet efficiency. Afternoons often revolved around the child, whose schedule naturally influenced everyone else in the home. Nap times brought brief periods of stillness before the energy of toddlerhood returned to fill the rooms once more. The nursery itself reflected careful attention rather than luxury. Children's books occupied shelves within easy reach of adults. Small toys rested neatly in baskets. A sturdy crib stood near the window where fresh air could circulate during warmer months. Blankets, clothing, and bedtime essentials remained meticulously organized. And believed environments shaped children. She preferred calm surroundings. Natural light. Simple routines. Consistency. Her writing often revealed an appreciation for reflection and quiet observation, qualities she hoped would define family life despite the constant pressures outside the estate. Charles shared that vision in his own way. Though frequently occupied by professional obligations, he guarded family time with determination. He understood that no accomplishment could replace moments lost during his son's earliest years. Friends recalled seeing a different side of the famous aviator whenever he interacted with little Charles. The reserved public figure disappeared, replaced by a father amused by small jokes, fascinated by tiny discoveries, and willing to set aside international recognition for the simple joy of watching his child grow. Those ordinary scenes would later acquire heartbreaking significance. Investigators, journalists, historians, biographers. All would return repeatedly to descriptions of the family's peaceful routines, searching for clues hidden within normality. But normality rarely leaves clues. It simply exists until something shatters it. In retrospect, Highfields almost feels suspended between two different worlds. Inside the estate lived a young family trying to create an ordinary childhood. Outside existed a nation experiencing economic despair, increasing crime, and an insatiable fascination with celebrity. The Great Depression had altered countless lives. Desperation drove some people toward opportunities they might once have rejected. Kidnappings for ransom, though still relatively uncommon, were becoming an alarming criminal enterprise in parts of the United States. Wealth and public visibility made certain individuals attractive targets. The Lindbergh family possessed both. Whether the perpetrators selected their victim because of fame, perceived wealth, or simple opportunity remains one of the enduring questions surrounding the case. What is certain is this. Long before anyone climbed toward the nursery window on that cold March night, someone had already transformed Highfields from a family home into the object of careful attention. The peaceful estate had unknowingly entered the opening chapter of a tragedy that would forever change not only the lives of those inside its walls, but the course of American criminal justice itself. Looking back through the lens of history, it is tempting to imagine that the danger surrounding the Lindbergh family should have been obvious. Modern readers know how the story ends. We know the headlines that would dominate newspapers for months. We know the photographs of investigators examining broken wood beneath a nursery window. We know the courtroom packed with reporters, the endless debates over evidence, and the lingering questions that continue to divide historians nearly a century later. But the people living those days knew none of it. For them, Highfields was still a sanctuary. The greatest threat they imagined was the loss of privacy, not the loss of a child. That distinction matters because it reminds us how ordinary tragedy often appears before it reveals itself. Nothing in the family's daily routine suggested they were standing at the edge of one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history. The clock still chimed each hour with quiet regularity. The fireplaces still warmed the rooms against the lingering cold of late winter. Household staff continued their responsibilities with practiced familiarity. Letters arrived each morning, some from friends, many from complete strangers expressing admiration for Charles Lindbergh or offering blessings for his young family. Most of those letters were harmless. Some contained gifts. Others contained requests for photographs or autographs. A few were unusual enough to be remembered. Fame had taught the Lindberghs that public attention came in many forms, ranging from heartfelt appreciation to unsettling obsession. Yet even the strangest correspondence rarely hinted at genuine danger. The family had become accustomed to living beneath a constant spotlight. What they had not become accustomed to was imagining that someone might attempt to cross the invisible boundary separating admiration from violence. The world surrounding Highfields was changing in ways that few fully understood. The United States of the early 1930s was a nation wrestling with uncertainty. Economic hardship had altered the rhythms of everyday life. Jobs disappeared almost overnight. Families who had once lived comfortably suddenly found themselves standing in soup lines or selling treasured possessions just to survive another week. Hope became a precious commodity. Crime, too, evolved alongside those hardships. Bank robberies made national headlines. Organized criminal groups expanded their influence in several major cities. Outlaws became unlikely celebrities in newspaper stories that often blurred the line between reporting and entertainment. Americans followed tales of gangsters with a mixture of fascination and fear. Against that backdrop, Charles Lindbergh represented something fundamentally different. He was not famous because he entertained audiences. He was not admired because of wealth or political power. He had earned the nation's respect through extraordinary discipline and undeniable achievement. Perhaps that was why the public felt such a deep emotional connection to him. His success seemed honest, earned, inspirational. People believed they knew him. In reality, they knew the public image carefully constructed through headlines and photographs. The private man remained far more reserved. Those closest to Charles often described him as methodical, thoughtful, and intensely self-disciplined. He valued preparation over improvisation. Whether planning a flight or organizing family life, he preferred careful routines and practical solutions. And complemented those qualities with warmth, intelligence, and remarkable emotional resilience. Together they formed a partnership built less upon public glamour than mutual respect. Their son completed that picture. Visitors frequently remarked on the atmosphere inside the house whenever little Charles was present. Conversation softened. Formality dissolved. Even the famous aviator whose achievements had captivated the world seemed happiest when kneeling on the nursery floor beside his child, watching him discover another ordinary miracle through the curious eyes only toddlers possess. There is something profoundly human about those scenes. History often reduces famous people to achievements or tragedies, overlooking the countless ordinary moments that occupy most of every life. The Lindbergh family shared breakfasts, read bedtime stories, celebrated small milestones, worried about childhood illnesses, laughed at simple games. They existed not as symbols but as parents and a son. That humanity is easy to lose once a crime transforms individuals into historical figures. Yet it is precisely that humanity which makes the events of March 1932 so haunting. The crime did not invade a palace protected by soldiers. It entered a family home. It reached into a nursery where childhood should have remained untouched. Even the house itself seemed to embody that sense of security. Thick stone walls suggested permanence. Broad staircases connected quiet bedrooms arranged around the routines of domestic life rather than displays of wealth. During daylight, sunlight poured through large windows overlooking peaceful countryside. At night, darkness settled gently across the surrounding hills, interrupted only by scattered lights from distant farmhouses. To the family, those quiet nights represented everything they had searched for. To someone watching from outside, they may have represented opportunity. Whether the estate had been observed for days, weeks, or even months remains uncertain. Investigators would later consider countless possibilities. Did someone study the family's schedule? Did they know which room belonged to the child? Had they visited the property before under an innocent pretense? Or was the plan assembled from publicly available information scattered across newspapers and magazines? No definitive answer has ever emerged. That uncertainty continues to fuel debate because it touches the central mystery underlying the entire case. How does someone penetrate the private world of America's most famous family without attracting attention? It is a question that investigators struggle to answer from the very beginning. As we move deeper into this story, it becomes important to separate established facts from speculation. The Lindbergh kidnapping has inspired countless theories over the decades. Some are grounded in evidence presented during the investigation and trial. Others rely upon assumptions, rumors, or reinterpretations developed many years later. Distinguishing between them is essential because the truth of this case has often become blurred beneath the weight of its own legend. Certain facts, however, remain beyond dispute. On the evening of March 1, 1932, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was alive inside the nursery at Highfields. His parents believed he was safe. The household followed its normal routine. By the end of that night, the child would be gone. Everything that follows grows from that single, devastating reality. The investigation would stretch across years. Thousands of leads would be pursued. Experts would argue over handwriting, lumber, fingerprints, and witness testimony. The courtroom would become one of the most closely watched legal battlegrounds of the 20th century. Even after a conviction, doubts would survive. Some would insist justice had prevailed. Others would spend decades questioning whether the full truth had ever been uncovered. But before detectives assembled evidence, before reporters crowded outside courthouses, before the nation debated guilt and innocence, there was one ordinary evening that began like countless others. Dinner had ended. The house settled into its familiar quiet. Outside, the final traces of daylight slipped behind the New Jersey hills as cold air drifted through the surrounding forest. Inside the nursery, a 20-month-old boy rested peacefully, unaware that his name would soon become known around the world. His parents moved through the comforting routines that every family assumes will continue tomorrow. They believed the night belonged to them. They did not know that somewhere beyond the darkness, another plan had already begun. And before the clocks inside Highfields could mark the passing of many more hours, one of the most chilling nights in American criminal history would quietly unfold, leaving behind an empty crib, a broken ladder, and a mystery that has refused to disappear for nearly a century. Before the world came to know him as the child at the center of America's most infamous kidnapping, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was simply a little boy discovering life one small moment at a time. History would remember photographs of investigators, courtroom sketches, and stacks of ransom notes. It would preserve endless debates over evidence and guilt. Yet the person at the heart of the case left behind no testimony, no diary, no memories told in his own words. His life ended before language could fully become his own. The only story that remains is the one reconstructed through the people who loved him most. He entered the world on June 22, 1930, at a time when the Lindbergh name carried extraordinary weight. Newspapers announced his birth almost as if it were a national celebration. Headlines stretched across front pages. Editors understood that readers who had followed Charles Lindbergh's remarkable journey across the Atlantic now wanted to witness every new chapter in his family life. Across the United States, millions of people who had never met the child smiled at photographs showing a proud father carefully holding his newborn son. For the public, the baby represented continuity. America's greatest hero had become a father. For Charles and Anne, however, the moment meant something far more personal. It marked the beginning of a new life defined not by aviation records or international recognition, but by bedtime routines, sleepless nights, tiny milestones, and the quiet responsibilities that accompany parenthood. Friends noticed subtle changes in Charles almost immediately. The disciplined aviator who had once devoted nearly every waking hour to planning flights and studying navigation now found himself captivated by experiences no newspaper would ever consider newsworthy. He could spend long stretches simply watching his son sleep. He listened for the first uncertain attempts at speech with the same concentration he had once reserved for the sound of an aircraft engine. Every new expression on the child's face seemed to fascinate him. And embraced motherhood with equal devotion. Her journals and writings throughout her life revealed an extraordinary ability to observe small details that many people overlooked. She appreciated quiet moments, the changing seasons, the shifting light across a room, the emotions hidden beneath ordinary conversations. Those same qualities shaped the way she experienced motherhood. She paid attention to every stage of her son's development, celebrating progress that outsiders might barely notice. A stronger grip on a toy. A steadier step across the floor. A smile appearing at the familiar sound of his father's footsteps. To most families, these moments pass almost unnoticed because they are expected. For Charles and Anne, they became precious reminders that inside Highfields, life could still feel wonderfully ordinary. Despite the public attention surrounding the Lindbergh name, they worked carefully to ensure their son experienced childhood rather than celebrity. Visitors often remarked that there was nothing theatrical about the atmosphere inside the home. There were no elaborate displays. No attempts to raise the child as a public figure. Instead, the nursery reflected warmth, simplicity, and comfort. Children's books occupied low shelves. Toys rested neatly in baskets waiting for eager little hands. Sunlight poured through the windows during the day, illuminating polished wooden floors where Charles Jr. spent hours exploring his rapidly expanding world. At 20 months old, every corner of the house offered a new adventure. A staircase became a mountain. A chair became a hiding place. A spoon tapping against a wooden table became music. His curiosity seemed endless. Household staff described him as cheerful and energetic, the kind of child whose laughter could transform the mood of an entire room. Even those employed primarily for practical responsibilities found themselves smiling whenever he wandered into view with the determined confidence unique to toddlers convinced they could conquer the world. He had not yet learned the meaning of danger. Nor had he learned the meaning of fame. The cameras occasionally appearing outside the property meant nothing to him. The strangers requesting photographs were invisible concepts beyond his understanding. He recognized only familiar faces. His mother. His father. His nurse. The household employees who greeted him every morning. That innocence gives the case its enduring emotional weight. Charles Jr. never became famous through anything he chose to do. He became famous because of who loved him. Every child enters the world surrounded by dreams that parents quietly construct for the future. Charles and Anne were no different. Though they rarely spoke publicly about long-term ambitions for their son, those close to the family sensed they wanted something remarkably simple. They hoped he would grow free from the burdens imposed by his father's extraordinary reputation. Charles understood better than anyone how fame could consume ordinary life. He did not expect his son to repeat his achievements. He hoped instead that the boy would be free to discover his own path. Perhaps he would become an engineer, a writer, a scientist, a pilot, or perhaps something entirely different. The future remained beautifully unwritten. That possibility made every passing month exciting. The child was changing almost daily. His vocabulary slowly expanded. His confidence increased. He became more adventurous, eager to explore beyond the nursery under the careful supervision of adults who constantly balanced encouraging independence with ensuring safety. Meals became lively events. He laughed easily. He displayed the unpredictable curiosity shared by children everywhere. One afternoon he might become fascinated by sunlight dancing across the floor. The next, he could spend 20 minutes examining a leaf carried indoors on someone's shoe. And often found herself pausing simply to observe him. Not because anything extraordinary was happening. Because ordinary childhood itself felt extraordinary. Charles approached fatherhood with a quieter affection. He was not naturally expressive in public, but family friends described unmistakable warmth whenever he interacted with his son. The famous aviator who appeared so composed before enormous crowds would willingly crawl across the nursery floor chasing a laughing toddler. Professional accomplishments disappeared the moment he crossed the threshold into family life. There, he was simply Dad. Those moments mattered enormously because they revealed the private man hidden beneath public legend. History frequently remembers Charles Lindbergh as a pioneering aviator, an international celebrity, and later, a grieving father. His son knew only the last role. Children do not measure their parents by headlines. They measure them by presence, by familiar voices, by comforting routines, by the certainty that someone will always appear when they call. Within Highfields, that certainty seemed unbreakable. The estate itself became woven into the fabric of the boy's earliest experiences. He watched changing weather through nursery windows. During warmer days, he spent time outdoors surrounded by fields that stretched beyond his understanding of distance. Birds fascinated him. Moving shadows invited investigation. Every season introduced entirely new sights, sounds, and textures. Spring brought blossoms. Summer filled the air with insects humming beneath blue skies. Autumn covered the ground with leaves that crunched beneath tiny shoes. Winter transformed familiar paths into landscapes dusted with frost. For a child barely beginning to understand the world, Highfields was not an estate. It was the whole universe. Every familiar face existed within its walls. Every comforting routine began and ended there. Every morning promised another day of discovery. No one, not his parents, not the household staff, not the millions of strangers who admired the Lindbergh family from afar, could imagine how quickly that universe would disappear. Because while the little boy continued exploring his world with complete trust, someone else, somewhere beyond the peaceful boundaries of Highfields, may already have begun watching it with entirely different intentions. The tragedy of the Lindbergh kidnapping is often told through the lens of what was lost. The empty crib. The ransom note. The investigation. The courtroom. The execution. But before any of those events existed, there was a child whose life contained far more than the terrible moment that would define his place in history. Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was not a symbol. He was not a headline. He was not a piece of evidence. He was a son. A grandson. A little boy whose world was still small enough to be measured by the people closest to him and the rooms he explored each day. At 20 months old, his personality was beginning to emerge in ways familiar to any parent watching a child grow. He was entering that remarkable stage between infancy and early childhood when curiosity becomes almost unstoppable. The world is no longer just a collection of sounds and colors. It becomes a place filled with questions. What happens if I touch this? Where does that door lead? Why does my father leave and then return? How far can I walk? How many things can I discover before someone gently guides me back? For Charles and Anne, these small moments represented the beginning of a future they believed would stretch for decades. They did not see a famous surname when they looked at him. They saw possibility. They saw a child who had inherited not only a remarkable family history but also the chance to create an identity completely separate from it. That hope was especially important to Charles Lindbergh. His own childhood had been shaped by independence and movement. He had never been someone who comfortably accepted expectations placed upon him. His achievements came partly from his willingness to challenge assumptions and pursue paths others considered impossible. He understood that individuality mattered. He wanted his son to have that freedom. The irony was that the world had already decided who Charles Jr. was before he could even understand the meaning of his own name. To millions of Americans, he was the child of the famous aviator. Photographs of him appeared in newspapers because readers felt connected to the family. People followed his growth from a distance, celebrating milestones they had never personally witnessed. In a way, the public had adopted him emotionally. But public affection could never replace private love. Inside Highfields, the child belonged only to his family. The household protected his routines carefully. Meals happened according to familiar schedules. Rest periods were maintained. Visitors were limited. The nursery remained a private space where the pressures of fame were temporarily kept outside. Anne especially valued the importance of preserving childhood innocence. She understood that children absorb the emotional atmosphere around them. A home filled with anxiety creates a different childhood than a home filled with security. Despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding their family, she worked to create normal experiences whenever possible. She read to him. She played with him. She watched him learn. She documented moments that seemed insignificant at the time but became priceless memories afterward. A child's first steps. A new word spoken incorrectly. A sudden burst of laughter over something adults could not understand. These are the details that define parenthood. Not the grand occasions. Not the public celebrations. The quiet moments. The ones nobody photographs because they feel like they will happen forever. That belief, that tomorrow will resemble today, is one of the most universal assumptions of human life. It is also one of the most fragile. Before the kidnapping, the Lindbergh family was experiencing the same illusion shared by families everywhere. They believed routines would continue. They believed familiar rooms would remain familiar. They believed the people they loved would be there when morning arrived. The human mind struggles to imagine sudden catastrophe. Especially inside a home. Especially involving a child. The nursery at Highfields represented protection. Parents around the world understand the instinct behind creating such a space. A crib is not merely furniture. It represents trust. It is where a parent places a child after carefully checking blankets, temperature, and comfort. It is where they whisper good night. It is where they believe their child will remain until morning. For the Lindberghs, that belief would be shattered in a single night. But before that happened, the nursery was filled with life. The room held evidence of a child growing. Small clothes that no longer fit. Toys that had become familiar favorites. Books waiting to be opened again. Objects that carried memories only the family understood. After the kidnapping, investigators would photograph those same surroundings not as a home but as a crime scene. That transformation is one of the most painful aspects of the case. A place created for love became a place examined for clues. A room designed for dreams became the starting point of a nightmare. The family would never again see Highfields in the same way. Yet the child who once filled that room with life remained at the center of everything. The public often imagined Charles Jr. through a single photograph, a smiling toddler whose face represented innocence. That image appeared repeatedly in newspapers and became permanently associated with the tragedy. But photographs capture only a fraction of a person's existence. Behind that image was a developing personality. A child learning the world. A child surrounded by affection. A child whose future was imagined by parents who loved him deeply. It is important to remember that future when examining the crime. Because true crime stories can sometimes become so focused on the perpetrator, the evidence, and the investigation that the victim disappears beneath the details. In the Lindbergh case, that risk is especially powerful. The criminal investigation became one of the largest in American history. The trial became a national spectacle. The suspect became a subject of endless debate. But before Bruno Richard Hauptmann became a name associated with the case, there was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. A child who never had the opportunity to tell his own story. His story exists through those who remembered him. Through his parents' grief. Through the photographs preserved over time. Through the details of a brief life that ended far too soon. And perhaps that is why the case continues to affect people decades later. Because beneath every legal argument and historical question is a simple truth. A child was taken from his family. A mother lost her son. A father lost the future he imagined. A home lost its sense of safety. The world would eventually focus on the mystery surrounding his disappearance. But to Charles and Anne, there was never a mystery about what mattered most. Their son was not a national symbol. He was not a historical event waiting to happen. He was the little boy whose footsteps once crossed the floors of Highfields. The child whose laughter once interrupted quiet conversations. The person whose existence made an enormous house feel like a home. And on the night when everything changed, that was the person they were searching for, not a famous name, not a headline, but their child. The deeper we look into the life of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., the clearer it becomes that the tragedy surrounding him was not only about what happened on one terrible night. It was also about everything that should have happened afterward. The birthdays that never arrived. The questions he never had the chance to ask. The places he never visited. The person he never had the opportunity to become. Every victim leaves behind an unfinished story. For a child, that unfinished story feels especially painful because so much of life exists only in possibility. At 20 months old, Charles Jr. stood at the very beginning of his journey. His personality was developing. His interests were emerging. His relationship with the world was expanding every day. He had not yet chosen his passions or discovered his talents. He had not yet experienced friendships, school adventures, or the countless ordinary moments that shape a human life. He was a future that disappeared before anyone could see what it would become. That is what made the Lindbergh kidnapping different from many crimes that captured public attention. The nation did not only mourn a child who had been taken. It mourned the future that had been stolen. Parents across America looked at their own children and imagined the unimaginable. They understood the fear immediately. A child sleeping peacefully. A home believed to be safe. A normal evening suddenly transformed into terror. The Lindbergh family tragedy crossed the boundary between celebrity and ordinary humanity because, despite their extraordinary fame, their pain was something everyone could understand. A mother hearing that her child is gone. A father searching a dark room hoping reality has somehow been misunderstood. A family waiting beside a telephone, knowing that one call could change everything. These emotions belonged not to famous people, but to parents. And that is why the disappearance of Charles Jr. created such a powerful reaction across the country. The public had followed Charles Lindbergh's victories. Now they followed his suffering. The same newspapers that once celebrated his courage now carried stories of desperation. The same crowds that once gathered to cheer his name now waited anxiously for news about his son. The Lindbergh family had become connected to America in a way few families ever experience, not through celebration, but through collective grief. Yet beneath all the attention, there remained a private tragedy that cameras could never fully capture. And Morrow Lindbergh was not mourning a symbol. She was mourning the child whose presence had shaped every day of her life. The small routines that once filled the house suddenly became reminders of absence. A toy left untouched. A room that no longer carried a child's laughter. A chair that remained empty. Objects become powerful after loss because they preserve ordinary moments. A toy is not valuable because of what it costs. A blanket is not meaningful because of its material. They matter because someone loved them. Someone held them. Someone associated them with a living person. For Anne, every corner of the nursery carried memories. For Charles, every decision afterward carried the unbearable weight of wondering whether something could have been done differently. That question would haunt many families after tragedy. What if? What if a different decision had been made? What if a different precaution had been taken? What if someone had noticed something earlier? Questions like these rarely provide answers. Instead, they become permanent companions to grief. The Lindbergh kidnapping would eventually become a case studied by investigators, lawyers, and historians. Evidence would be measured. Statements would be compared. Theories would be debated. But no investigation could undo the simplest fact. A family had lost a child. Before the investigators arrived, before the newspapers filled with speculation, before the courtroom became a battlefield of competing arguments, there was only a mother and father trying to find their son. That human element remains essential when examining what happened next. Because the investigation that followed would become enormous. It would involve law enforcement agencies, private investigators, experts, informants, and thousands of tips from across the country. The search for answers would stretch over years and expose both the strengths and weaknesses of early 20th century criminal investigation. Technology was limited compared with modern standards. There were no advanced DNA databases, no digital records, no surveillance networks. Investigators relied on physical evidence, witness memories, handwriting comparisons, and painstaking detective work. A single clue could become the difference between success and failure. A single mistake could destroy an entire lead. And every person involved understood that the stakes were not simply professional. A child's life was believed to depend on every decision. That pressure would shape the investigation from the very beginning. The crime had already violated the most sacred assumption of family life, that home is a place of safety. Now the investigators faced another impossible task. They had to enter a world of uncertainty and find someone who had disappeared into the shadows. Who built the ladder? Who wrote the ransom note? Who knew enough about the family to target them? Was the child still alive? Was the kidnapper acting alone? Or was something far more complicated unfolding behind the scenes? These questions would dominate headlines for months. But before those questions could be answered, the first challenge was simply understanding what had happened inside Highfields on that cold March night. A window had been opened. A child had vanished. And an entire nation was about to begin a search for the truth. The investigation would become one of the most famous criminal investigations in American history. But every investigation begins with a single moment. A moment when the impossible becomes real. For the Lindbergh family, that moment was standing inside the nursery and realizing that the future they had imagined for their son had been stolen away. The world would remember the case. The world would remember the trial. The world would remember the controversy. But before all of that, there was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., a little boy whose life was brief, whose story was interrupted, and whose memory remains at the center of one of America's most haunting mysteries. The night of March 1, 1932, did not announce itself as the beginning of a tragedy. There was no warning in the sky. No unusual disturbance in the streets. No voice calling out from the darkness. No instinct that told the Lindbergh family to stop, to look closer, to question the ordinary rhythm of the evening. That is what makes the events of that night so haunting. The most devastating moments in history rarely arrive with the sound and chaos people expect. They often enter quietly, hidden inside familiar surroundings. A house remains a home until one door opens differently. A room remains a nursery until someone removes the person who gives it meaning. A peaceful evening remains peaceful until the moment it is not. At Highfields, the world outside had already fallen into darkness. The estate rested beneath the cold New Jersey sky, surrounded by fields and woods that stretched away from the house in every direction. The last traces of daylight had disappeared hours earlier. The winter air carried a sharp chill, and the ground beneath the property held the dampness of the season. Inside, however, the house remained warm. The fireplaces softened the cold. The lights created small islands of comfort against the darkness beyond the windows. The familiar sounds of family life continued. The Lindbergh household was following a routine that had repeated itself countless times before. A child was asleep. Parents were nearby. Tomorrow was waiting. Nothing suggested that the night would become one of the most examined nights in American history. The nursery where Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. slept was located on the second floor of the house. It was a room designed for protection and comfort. The crib stood near the window. The child's belongings were arranged around him. Everything reflected the care of parents who believed they had created a safe environment for their son. The window, however, would become the most important detail in the entire case. At some point that evening, someone outside approached it. Whoever came to Highfields had not arrived unprepared. The crime required planning. The person responsible had to know where the nursery was located. They had to understand the layout of the property. They had to approach a famous family's home without being detected. They had to carry equipment across uneven ground and remain calm while committing a crime that carried enormous risks. The object that revealed the intruder's method was a homemade wooden ladder. It was not a simple tool found nearby. It had been constructed specifically for the purpose of reaching the second-floor window. The ladder would later become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the case because it represented something chilling: preparation. Someone had considered the height of the window. Someone had calculated the distance. Someone had built a way inside. The ladder consisted of 3 sections, designed to be assembled and positioned against the house. It was awkward, heavy, and far from perfect. Yet it served its purpose. The person who brought it there understood that the risk of discovery increased with every second spent outside. The darkness provided cover. The isolation provided opportunity. The quiet countryside provided silence. The intruder climbed. At this point, the exact sequence of events remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. Investigators would later reconstruct possibilities, but no one could say with absolute certainty what happened during those missing minutes. Did the kidnapper enter through the window? Did the ladder break during the climb down? Was the child awake or asleep? Did the noise of the operation go unnoticed because of distance and timing? These unanswered questions would remain at the center of countless discussions. What is known is that sometime during the night, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was taken from his room. A child who had been placed safely in his crib before bedtime was suddenly gone. The person who carried him away left behind only fragments of evidence. The ladder. The ransom note. The empty space where a child had been. The ransom note itself introduced another layer of mystery. It was not a random message written in panic. It contained specific instructions. The writer demanded money in exchange for the child's return. The amount was stated clearly: $50,000. For 1932, that was an enormous sum. The United States was deep in the Great Depression. Thousands of families were struggling to pay rent, buy food, or maintain basic stability. $50,000 represented a fortune. It suggested that whoever wrote the note believed the Lindbergh family had access to extraordinary wealth and would be willing to pay almost any price to recover their son. The letter also contained unusual markings. A strange symbol made of circles and small holes appeared as a kind of signature. It was not a name. It was not a recognizable mark. Instead, it served as an identifier, a way for future communications to be confirmed as genuine. That detail revealed something important. The person behind the crime expected negotiations. They expected future contact. They believed they had control over what would happen next. But the ransom note also contained something unsettling. The writing itself was imperfect. The grammar was unusual. The spelling mistakes were obvious. The language appeared to come from someone who was either unfamiliar with proper English or intentionally attempting to disguise their writing style. For investigators, this created a puzzle. Was the writer truly uneducated? Was the unusual language an act? Was the person foreign-born? Was the handwriting natural or deliberately altered? Every small detail became significant because the entire investigation depended on tiny fragments. The first hours after discovery were filled with confusion and disbelief. When the absence of the child was finally recognized, the reaction inside Highfields was immediate. Panic replaced routine. The peaceful house transformed into a place of frantic movement. Footsteps echoed through hallways. Voices that had been calm moments earlier became urgent. The possibility that seemed impossible had become reality. Charles Lindbergh entered the nursery and saw what no parent should ever see. The crib was empty. His son was gone. The room that had represented safety now contained evidence of a violation that felt impossible to comprehend. The window stood open. Cold air entered the room. Outside was darkness. And beneath that darkness was the beginning of a mystery that would consume an entire nation. The first instinct of any parent in such a moment is simple. Find the child. Nothing else matters. Not fame. Not money. Not public attention. Only the immediate need to bring the child home. For Charles Lindbergh, the man who had once crossed an ocean alone, this was a different kind of mission. There was no aircraft to control. No route to calculate. No technical problem to solve. Only fear. And somewhere beyond the walls of Highfields, an unknown person held the one thing the family valued above everything else. Their son. As the first calls were made and authorities began rushing toward the estate, the kidnapping stopped being a private family nightmare. It became a national emergency. The world would soon know that the most famous aviator in America had lost his child. And everyone would begin asking the same terrifying question. Where was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr.? The first hours after a child disappears are measured differently. Minutes become unbearable. Every passing second feels like a decision being made somewhere beyond your control. For most families, the middle of the night is a time when the world slows down. Houses become quieter. Streets empty. People retreat into private spaces where the problems of the day temporarily disappear. But inside Highfields, time moved faster than anyone could process. The peaceful routine of the evening had been destroyed. The house that had once represented safety became a place filled with uncertainty. Every person inside was searching for an explanation that did not exist. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. Perhaps someone had moved the child. Perhaps Charles Jr. was somewhere else inside the house. The human mind often refuses to accept impossible things immediately. It searches for ordinary answers before allowing itself to face an extraordinary reality. But the evidence was there. The empty crib. The open window. The ladder outside. The ransom note. Each detail pushed the family closer to a truth they desperately wanted to reject. Their child had been taken. The first people to respond were not investigators with years of experience handling major crimes. They were frightened individuals trying to protect a family. Neighbors arrived. Local authorities were contacted. Questions began before anyone had answers. Who could have entered the property? How long had the child been missing? Had anyone seen a vehicle nearby? Had anyone heard anything unusual? The problem was that the crime had happened in silence. There had been no struggle that anyone could describe. No clear witness. No obvious trail leading away from the house. The person responsible had left behind only carefully chosen pieces of evidence, almost as if the absence of information itself was part of the plan. Outside the nursery window, investigators found the ladder. The sight of it immediately changed the nature of the search. This was not a disappearance. This was an intrusion. Someone had physically entered the family's private world. The ladder rested beneath the window, damaged and abandoned. One section had broken, suggesting that something had gone wrong during the escape. But even that detail created more questions than answers. Had the ladder broken because of the weight of an adult climbing down? Had the person carrying the child struggled? Had the fall injured the kidnapper? Had the child been harmed during that moment? Every possibility carried a different implication. Investigators examined the ground around the ladder carefully. The weather conditions became important. The soil, the footprints, the disturbed areas near the house, all of these details might reveal how the intruder had arrived and how they had escaped. But the crime scene was not preserved in the way modern investigators would expect. The scale of the event was unprecedented. The first responders were operating under enormous pressure. Many people moved through the area. Curious individuals gathered. Authorities had to balance the need for immediate action with the need to preserve evidence. In the chaos of those early hours, the investigation began with uncertainty. And uncertainty was the kidnapper's greatest advantage. The ransom letter offered the family one fragile piece of hope. The child was not taken without explanation. A demand had been made. Money was requested. A negotiation was possible. For Charles and Anne, that meant there was still a chance. The person who had taken their son wanted something. And if that person wanted something, perhaps they would return him. That belief became the foundation of the family's decisions in the weeks that followed. But ransom cases are psychological battles. The criminal attempts to create fear while maintaining control. The victim's family attempts to remain calm while experiencing unimaginable desperation. Every message matters. Every delay creates panic. Every mistake can have consequences. The unknown writer of the ransom note had placed the Lindbergh family in exactly that position. They were powerful enough to be famous, wealthy enough to pay, connected enough to attract national attention. Yet in that moment, none of those things mattered. A parent waiting for news about a missing child is not a celebrity. They are simply a parent. Charles Lindbergh, known worldwide for courage and determination, now faced a challenge that could not be solved through skill alone. He could not fly toward the answer. He could not engineer a solution. He could not force the outcome. He had to wait. And waiting became one of the most painful parts of the ordeal. The ransom demand initially requested $50,000. The amount was significant, but the Lindberghs understood that money was irrelevant compared with their son's safety. The family was prepared to cooperate. Their priority was not capturing the criminal. It was bringing Charles Jr. home alive. That decision also created a complicated situation for investigators. In many criminal cases, law enforcement attempts to move quickly toward identifying and arresting a suspect. In a kidnapping case, however, immediate arrest could endanger the victim. A suspect who feels trapped may panic. A frightened criminal may harm the hostage. The investigators had to move carefully. They needed information. They needed communication. They needed to understand the person they were dealing with. But the kidnapper remained hidden. Only the letters revealed their presence. The unusual symbol at the bottom of the ransom note became a signature of fear. It appeared almost like a message from someone who wanted to remind the family. I am the person in control. I decide when you hear from me. I decide what happens next. The psychological impact was enormous. The family was forced into a world where every day depended on someone they could not see. The public, meanwhile, became increasingly aware of the tragedy. News traveled quickly. By morning, reporters were already gathering. The name Lindbergh had always attracted attention, but this was different. This was not a story about achievement. It was a story about fear. People across America followed every development. Families listened to radio broadcasts hoping for good news. Newspapers printed updates throughout the day. The entire country seemed to be waiting alongside the Lindberghs. Yet the attention created another problem. The investigation became impossible to keep private. Every decision was examined. Every rumor spread. Every possible suspect became a subject of public discussion. The pressure was enormous. The world wanted answers. The family wanted their son. And somewhere, the person responsible remained silent. As the days passed, the ransom negotiations would become the central focus of the case. Messages would be exchanged. A mysterious intermediary would enter the story. Plans would be made for the transfer of money. But beneath all of those developments was the same unbearable question. Was Charles Jr. still alive? Every person involved hoped the answer was yes. No one wanted to consider the alternative. Because as long as hope remained, the search continued. As long as the telephone could ring, there was a possibility of a reunion. As long as another letter could arrive, the family could believe their child might return home. But behind the walls of Highfields, beneath the photographs and headlines, there was already a growing fear. The longer the child remained missing, the more fragile that hope became. And the investigation was only beginning. The days following the disappearance of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. became a strange mixture of urgency and helplessness. The world moved forward as it always does. Trains continued arriving at stations, factories continued operating, newspapers continued printing, but inside the Lindbergh household, time seemed trapped in the night when the child vanished. Every moment was defined by waiting. Waiting for a letter. Waiting for a phone call. Waiting for someone to provide the one piece of information that could end the nightmare. The family had entered a world where hope and fear existed together. Hope kept them searching. Fear reminded them of what could happen if the search failed. For Charles Lindbergh, the experience was unlike any challenge he had faced before. The public had always associated him with action. He was the man who crossed the Atlantic when others believed it could not be done. He was the pilot who remained calm through uncertainty, who trusted preparation and skill when facing impossible odds. But kidnapping was different. There was no cockpit. No instrument panel. No clear path forward. The person controlling the situation was invisible. Every decision required patience rather than action. And patience was perhaps the hardest thing to demand from a father whose child was missing. The ransom letter had created a fragile connection between the family and the kidnapper. The writer had promised communication. The family hoped that following instructions would lead to Charles Jr.'s safe return. But the criminal had created another form of control. Silence. A missing child creates a psychological emptiness that is almost impossible to describe. The family does not know whether to imagine the best possible outcome or prepare for the worst. Every hour without information becomes heavier than the one before. For Anne Morrow Lindbergh, the absence was overwhelming. The nursery remained filled with reminders of her son. The toys were still there. The blankets were still there. The room still looked prepared for a child who should have been sleeping inside it. Only the child was missing. That contrast made the loss almost impossible to accept. A room designed for life had become a place of unanswered questions. The investigation continued around them. Detectives searched for clues. Authorities reviewed possible suspects. Experts examined the ransom note. But for the family, the investigation was not about solving a famous crime. It was about finding their child. That distinction would remain important throughout the entire case. As public attention grew, the pressure surrounding the investigation became extraordinary. The Lindbergh name ensured that every development reached millions of people. Newspapers competed for information. Reporters attempted to uncover details before authorities were ready to release them. Rumors traveled quickly, often creating confusion rather than clarity. Some claimed to know the identity of the kidnapper. Some claimed to have seen the child. Some sent false information seeking attention or reward. Each false lead carried an emotional cost. For investigators, it meant wasted time. For the family, it meant brief moments of hope followed by devastating disappointment. The case became larger than anyone involved could control. The nation was watching. The world was watching. And somewhere behind all of the headlines, one person remained hidden. The kidnapper's communication style suggested confidence. The ransom note was not written like a desperate confession. It was written like a business transaction. Money in exchange for a child. Instructions. Conditions. Rules. The writer appeared to believe they had planned every detail. The unusual signature symbol added to the mystery. It was intended to serve as proof that future communications came from the same person. In theory, it would prevent confusion and allow negotiations to continue. But it also revealed something about the kidnapper's mindset. They wanted to create a system. A structure. A controlled process where they decided what information was shared and when. That sense of control would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. The ransom demand eventually increased from $50,000 to $70,000. The reason behind the change remains part of the larger mystery. Perhaps the kidnapper believed the original amount was too low. Perhaps they wanted to test how far the family would go. Perhaps the increase reflected changing circumstances within the criminal plan. Whatever the reason, the message was clear. The person responsible believed the Lindbergh family would continue negotiating. And they were right. The family agreed to pay. The money itself became carefully prepared. Every bill was recorded. Every serial number was documented. At the time, investigators understood that tracking the ransom money might eventually lead them to the kidnapper. But their immediate priority was recovery of the child. The investigation existed under a terrible condition. The evidence pointed toward a criminal. The ransom demanded cooperation. The victim was still missing. These goals did not always align. The authorities had to move carefully. Too much pressure could provoke the kidnapper. Too little action could allow them to disappear. Meanwhile, the public fascination with the case intensified. The Lindbergh kidnapping became more than a crime story. It became a national emotional experience. People who had never met the family felt personally invested. Letters arrived expressing sympathy. Strangers offered advice. Some claimed to have psychic abilities. Others sent theories. Many simply wanted to help. But the flood of attention also created chaos. Thousands of tips had to be examined. Most led nowhere. Some were impossible to verify. A few created genuine investigative possibilities. The case had become so famous that almost anyone could insert themselves into the story. That was the challenge facing investigators. They were not searching for answers in silence. They were searching through a storm of information. And still, one question remained above everything else. Where was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr.? The ransom exchange was eventually arranged through an unlikely figure who would become one of the most important people in the early stages of the case. John F. Condon, a retired school teacher from the Bronx, entered the story after publicly offering to help. His involvement would create a strange bridge between the terrified family and the unseen person who claimed to hold their son's fate. Through him, the kidnapper would communicate. Through him, the ransom negotiations would continue. And through him, investigators would receive some of their first direct clues about the person behind the crime. But even as the negotiations moved forward, a darker possibility remained hidden beneath the surface. The family believed they were working toward a reunion. They believed the money would open the door to bringing their son home. They believed the person behind the crime was following a plan that ended with a living child returned to his parents. That belief was the only thing keeping them moving. Because the alternative was too painful to face. The possibility that the child might never return. The possibility that the ransom was not a path to rescue, but simply another step in a tragedy that had already reached its final moment. No one inside Highfields wanted to believe that. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance. Not while the next letter could still arrive. Not while the next telephone call could still bring hope. And so the search continued. A nation waited. A family prayed. Investigators followed every clue they could find. And somewhere in the darkness surrounding the Lindbergh kidnapping, the truth remained hidden. In every major criminal investigation, there is a moment when uncertainty begins to take shape. Before that moment, there are only possibilities. A missing person may still be found. A mystery may still have a simple explanation. A frightening situation may still end with relief. But there comes a point when the evidence forces people to confront a reality they have been desperately avoiding. For the Lindbergh family, that moment would arrive not in the nursery, not during the ransom negotiations, and not through a message from the kidnapper. It would come from the ground beneath the trees. For more than 2 months after Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. disappeared, the family lived inside a painful state of uncertainty. The ransom exchange had taken place. Money had changed hands. The person claiming responsibility had promised that the child was alive. That promise became the fragile foundation of hope. Every day after the payment, the family waited for the news they believed would come. A location. A message. A sign. Something that would lead them back to their son. But the days passed. Then the weeks. And still, Charles Jr. did not return. The silence became increasingly difficult to understand. A kidnapping for ransom usually depends on the victim remaining alive. The criminal wants payment. The family wants the victim returned. Both sides, despite their opposing positions, are connected by the same expectation. A living child. That expectation shaped every decision made after the ransom was delivered. Investigators followed leads. The family waited. The public speculated. But as time moved forward, a darker possibility began quietly emerging. Perhaps the child had never been alive after the first night. It was a possibility no one wanted to say aloud. Because accepting it meant accepting that the kidnapping had not been a continuing crisis. It meant the tragedy had already occurred. The ransom letters, the negotiations, the waiting, all of it might have been nothing more than a cruel illusion. Still, hope remained. Families often hold on to hope long after others begin preparing for grief. It is not because they ignore reality. It is because love creates a connection stronger than logic. A parent does not easily accept the idea that a child is gone forever. For Charles and Anne, the search continued. Then, on May 12, 1932, the investigation changed forever. That afternoon, approximately 2 months after the kidnapping, a truck driver traveling near the Lineburg estate made a discovery that would end the uncertainty in the most devastating way possible. The location was a wooded area near the road in Hopewell Township, New Jersey, roughly several miles from Highfields. It was not a place that attracted attention. There were no crowds. No major landmarks. Just trees, uneven ground, and the quiet isolation of rural New Jersey. The kind of place where something could remain hidden. The truck driver noticed something unusual near the roadside. At first, it was simply an object in the distance. Something that did not belong. He approached. What he found would become one of the most heartbreaking discoveries in American criminal history. The remains of Charles Augustus Lineburg Jr. The search that had consumed the nation for more than 2 months had reached its end. But it was not the ending anyone had hoped for. The news traveled quickly. Within hours, the hope that had surrounded the case collapsed into grief. The child who had become a symbol of innocence was gone. The family who had waited for a reunion now faced the reality they had feared most. The ransom money could not bring him home. The negotiations could not change what had happened. The promises made by the kidnapper had been false. The discovery transformed the entire investigation. Before that moment, authorities were investigating a kidnapping. After that moment, they were investigating a murder. The emotional landscape changed immediately. The question was no longer, "Where is the child?" It became, "Who took him? And who was responsible for his death?" The location where the body was found became a second crime scene. Investigators returned to the area with a different purpose. They were no longer searching for signs of a living victim. They were searching for evidence that could identify the person who had committed the crime. Every detail mattered. The position of the remains. The condition of the surrounding area. Any object left behind. Any trace that could reveal what had happened after the child was taken from Highfields. The medical examination provided devastating information. The child had suffered a severe injury to the head. The cause of death was determined to be trauma. The exact circumstances surrounding the injury remained uncertain. Was it accidental? Did something go wrong during the kidnapping? Was the child intentionally harmed? Those questions would remain part of the case's enduring mystery. The crime scene could reveal what happened physically. It could not reveal the thoughts of the person responsible. And that absence of understanding made the crime even more disturbing. A kidnapping requires planning. It requires preparation. It requires someone to decide that another human being can be treated as an object to be taken and exchanged. But the death of the child introduced another layer of horror. Somewhere along the way, a plan designed around money had resulted in the loss of a young life. The discovery also changed public emotion. Before May 12, many Americans followed the case with hope. They imagined the possibility of a dramatic rescue. They believed the famous Lineburg family might eventually be reunited. After May 12, that hope turned into anger. The nation wanted justice. The public demanded answers. People who had followed every development now wanted the person responsible found and punished. The pressure on investigators became enormous. The failure to recover the child alive was viewed as a tragedy. Finding the person responsible became a national mission. But beneath the demands for justice was something deeper. Grief. The image of a missing child had already touched millions of people. Now they were forced to confront the reality that the child would never come home. For Charles and Anne, the loss was beyond what words could express. The world knew their son's name. The world knew the details of the crime. But grief itself remained private. No headline could describe the emptiness inside the house. No investigation could restore the future that had disappeared. No conviction could return the moments that had been stolen. Yet the discovery of the child's body also marked the beginning of a new phase. The investigation no longer depended on negotiation. The authorities no longer had to protect the kidnapper's secret. They could pursue evidence without the same fear that a wrong move might endanger the victim. The search for Charles Jr. was over. The search for his killer had begun. And in the months that followed, investigators would examine every piece of evidence left behind from that terrible night. The broken ladder. The ransom notes. The money. The handwriting. The witnesses. Each clue would bring them closer to a suspect. But each clue would also raise new questions. Because the Lineburg kidnapping was not only a case about finding a criminal. It was a case about determining whether the truth could survive the enormous pressure surrounding it. The nation wanted justice. The family wanted answers. And the investigation was about to enter its most complicated chapter. The discovery of Charles Augustus Lineburg Jr. changed the emotional atmosphere of the entire country almost instantly. For more than 2 months, America had lived inside a strange state of collective anticipation. People had followed every development with the hope that the story would end with a child being carried back into his parents' arms. They imagined a reunion. They imagined relief. They imagined that the nightmare would eventually become a story of survival. That possibility disappeared on May 12, 1932. The child who had become the center of the largest search in American history was no longer missing. He was gone. The difference between those two realities was devastating. A missing child represents uncertainty. A lost child represents grief. And grief changes everything. Across the country, newspapers that had once printed updates filled with cautious optimism now carried headlines of shock and sorrow. The same photographs that had once been shared in hopes of finding him became reminders of a life that had ended far too soon. The public reaction was overwhelming. People who had never met the Lineburg family mourned as though they had lost someone they knew personally. Strangers wrote letters expressing sympathy. Communities held moments of silence. Parents looked at their own children and struggled to understand how such a thing could happen. The Lineburg kidnapping had already been a national tragedy. Now it had become something even darker. A murder case. For investigators, the discovery brought a painful clarity. The uncertainty surrounding the child's condition was gone. But certainty did not mean the case had become easier. In some ways, the investigation became even more difficult. A living victim can provide information. A living victim can be rescued. A living victim can identify the person responsible. A deceased victim can only leave behind evidence. And evidence requires interpretation. The investigators now had to reconstruct the final moments of a child who could no longer speak for himself. They had to determine what happened between the time Charles Jr. was taken from the nursery and the moment his body was found in the woods. Every possibility had to be considered. Every assumption had to be questioned. The distance between Highfields and the discovery location became an important detail. The body had been found relatively close to the Lindbergh estate, suggesting that the kidnapper may never have traveled far. This raised questions about whether the person responsible knew the area well. Had they been familiar with the roads? Had they lived nearby? Had they chosen the location because it was convenient or because it carried some personal significance? Investigators examined the surrounding terrain carefully. The wooded area provided privacy. The nearby roads offered access. The isolation that had once protected the Lindbergh family also made it possible for someone to move unseen. The same landscape that had created a peaceful home had become part of a crime scene. The forensic examination provided more details but also left important questions unanswered. The child had suffered a fatal injury to the head. The timing suggested that he had died not long after the kidnapping. This discovery was especially painful because it meant the family's long wait had been built upon a false hope. While Charles and Anne waited for letters and searched for signs of their son's return, the truth may have already been known only to the person responsible. That possibility added another layer of cruelty to the crime. The ransom negotiations, which had once represented hope, now appeared as an extension of the tragedy. Someone had continued communicating. Someone had allowed the family to believe their son might still be alive. Whether that was part of the original plan or an attempt to delay discovery remained uncertain. But the emotional damage was undeniable. The investigation immediately shifted focus. The ransom money became more important than ever. Before the discovery, authorities had been careful. They understood that tracking the money too aggressively could risk the child's safety. Now, that concern had changed. The child could no longer be endangered by the investigation. The money represented one of the strongest paths toward identifying the person responsible. The ransom had been prepared carefully. The serial numbers of the bills had been recorded before payment. This was a major investigative advantage. At the time, tracking marked currency was one of the few available methods for following a criminal after a ransom exchange. The authorities now had something tangible. A trail. Somewhere, the money would eventually have to be spent. And when it was spent, someone might notice. But the investigation still faced enormous obstacles. The crime had become one of the most famous cases in the world. That fame created both advantages and problems. The attention meant resources poured into the investigation. Officials received assistance from experts and investigators who wanted to help solve the case. But the attention also created confusion. Thousands of people offered theories. Some claimed knowledge they did not possess. Some provided false information. Some appeared to seek recognition rather than justice. Every serious lead had to be separated from the noise surrounding it. The investigators were searching for a person who had committed an incredibly bold crime. A person who had entered one of the most recognizable homes in America. A person who had taken the child of the nation's most famous aviator. That required a combination of intelligence, patience, and luck. The evidence from the crime scene began forming a picture. The ladder suggested planning. The ransom note suggested preparation. The money offered the possibility of eventually identifying the criminal. But none of those clues provided a name. Not yet. The person responsible remained hidden. And while investigators searched, another battle was taking place in the public arena. The newspapers wanted information. The public wanted justice. Politicians wanted action. Everyone wanted the mystery solved. The pressure became extraordinary. The Lindbergh name had transformed a local crime into a national crisis. The case was no longer only about one family. It had become a symbol of the fears of an entire era. If someone could take the child of Charles Lindbergh, one of the most famous and respected people in America, then many people wondered what protection ordinary families had. The kidnapping exposed a growing fear that wealth and fame could make someone a target. It also revealed the limitations of law enforcement at the time. Criminal investigation was evolving, but it did not yet possess many of the tools considered essential today. Investigators relied heavily on physical evidence, witness statements, and traditional detective work. A single mistake could destroy a lead. A single forgotten detail could allow a criminal to escape. The pressure was immense. But among all the evidence collected from Highfields, one clue would eventually become central to the entire case. It was not discovered in the woods. It was not found in the ransom money. It was hidden in the construction of an ordinary object left behind beneath the nursery window. The wooden ladder. At first, it appeared to be simply a tool used by the kidnapper. But as experts examined it more closely, they began noticing details that suggested it might reveal something far more important. The type of wood. The construction methods. The individual pieces. The person who built the ladder had unknowingly left behind a physical signature. A trace of their identity. And as investigators began studying that evidence, the search for the person behind the crime slowly moved from a mystery surrounding an unknown intruder toward a much narrower question. Who had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the materials to create that ladder? The answer would eventually lead investigators toward a man whose name would become permanently connected to one of the most controversial criminal trials in American history. But before they reached him, the investigation would pass through countless dead ends, false accusations, and competing theories. The road to justice would not be simple. Because the Lineberg kidnapping was no longer just a search for a missing child. It was a race to uncover the truth before the truth disappeared forever.